Chapter 766, The Deities Anchor. Knowing that the diary pages specially selected by Queen Mystic contained rather important information, the fool Klein focused his attention and cast his eyes on the yellowish-brown goatskin in his hand. September 11th. Ever since I became an angel, I've had the feeling that I've had my identity disassociated. In my heart, in my soul, and in the depths of my mind, there's ultimately a voice urging me, influencing me and creating an uncontrollable sense of coldness, bloodthirstiness, cruelty, and craziness. This doesn't stem from the external world or an influence from a god of the same pathway. I can clearly sense that it comes from one's genes, the collective subconsciousness of humanity from generation after generation. It stems from the beyonder characteristic itself, and not from the remnant psychological influences. It makes me have a strong desire to hunt and kill. It makes me want to devour all the living beings around me with beyonder characteristics. It requires me to spend a lot of effort to resist it. Even if I've already acted and digested the potion, it doesn't seem to improve. It's no wonder that Mr. Dorr said that rationality is temporary, but madness is eternal. September 28th. I haven't written a diary entry in ages. In the past half a month, I seem to see myself being replaced by a stranger. Bit by bit, I turn cold and terrifying. Even my daughter, Bernadette, can only allow me to show her minute amounts of fatherly love. Very, very tiny amounts. Just as I was about to go mad, I seemed to hear countless praises. They were from my subjects, people who had benefited from my reformations. They are the believers who view me as the son of steam. They praise me with great acclaim. They erected statues of me, write stories for me, and have created songs and poems for me. Their voices seem like a ship's anchor that helps me secure myself in place. I began to have the ability to resist that desire and that roar within me. Bit by bit, I walked out of it as I once again possessed the normal feelings of a father, a husband, and a man. Just sequence 2 alone causes such changes. At sequence 0, at the level of a true god, how terrifying would it be to resist that madness? Perhaps they also need an anchor so as to resist the beyonder characteristics and the strong inclination to lose control, the urges buried deep in the collective subconscious. I probably understand why they establish churches and why they want to spread their faith, to write stories for their faction saints and leave legends for their corresponding angels. But why do they not have any anthropomorphic form other than symbols? I can't understand it. I'll try asking Mr. Dorr in the future. He seems to know a lot in regards to the domain of deities. If he had been released back then, there might very well be an additional deity today. September 29th. After rereading yesterday's diary entry, I recalled the corresponding rituals of my sequence 4, sequence 3, and sequence 2. They clearly had hints of madness and cruelty, akin to the kinds held by antagonists in novels. A sequence pathway might very well be a path destined to be crazy and filled with despair. And this is the only path for humans to obtain extraordinary strength. How laughable and ironic it is. We strive to save ourselves, only to better destroy ourselves. The first page's content left Klein's heart heavy and repressed. The Roselle who had written those words was no longer an ordinary person, but someone who had become an angel, someone who had joined the Twilight Hermit Order, and someone who had seen the blasphemy slate. His understanding of the mysterious world and beyonder characteristics far exceeded him, but he was even more pessimistic than him. He seemed to believe that the world's origins were innately warped, crazy, and destined for destruction. However, the 7 deities have apparently found a way to maintain their rationality. Ordinary humans aren't without any use. Their cognition and their spirituality put together can help a deity anchor their original image, retaining their memories and reason that they had accumulated for years. This can be inferred from Roselle's own experiences. However, why would the 7 deities abandon their anthropomorphic images and use sacred emblems as a form of abstraction? This doesn't match my theories. I can't understand why. Klein didn't waste any time as he flipped to the next diary page. December 5th. Night of the blood moon. I conversed with Mr. Dorr. Like every time prior to this, he would always make a request to get me to help him return to the real world, but he doesn't overly insist on it. Furthermore, he would randomly answer some of my questions. Heh, it's like he is playing a game, trying hard to raise my affection towards him. But unfortunately, I'm sorry, I've already sealed off that option ahead of time. As I already knew of the legends of the Kings of Angels, I mainly asked Mr. Dorr about the level of strength that the Kings of Angels have, knowing the fact that I had nothing to lose by asking him that question. Mr. Dorr said that some of the Kings of Angels accommodated the uniqueness, while others had consumed 2 sets of Sequence 1 potions. It could also be both. The word accommodate is used in an odd manner. I had asked him about it, but Mr. Dorr didn't directly answer me. All he said was that if one was unable to accommodate the uniqueness, then the uniqueness was a burden instead of an aid to a Sequence 1 angel before they held the ritual to advance to Sequence 0. It's understandable. It's akin to using a Grade 0 sealed artifact. The negative effects are often terrifying, and the uniqueness must definitely be even more exaggerated. I also asked which Kings of Angels had accommodated their uniquenesses, and similarly, Mr. Dorr didn't give a direct answer. He only said that Amon and Adam make all the angels feel a sense of envy, because they were born with a uniqueness and didn't need to consider the problem of accommodation. From another point of view, does it mean that Amon and Adam's state is equivalent to having consumed a Sequence 1 potion and the uniqueness? As expected of the Creator's sons. That Creator, who's also known as the ancient Sun God, was actually so powerful that he could pass on a uniqueness to each of his 2 sons, as well as Sequence 1 Beyonder's characteristics. Was he trying to purify himself to eliminate any unneeded interference? Then, does Mr. Dorr also accommodate a uniqueness, and also possibly have even consumed 2 Sequence 1 potions? I didn't ask, because I knew he definitely wouldn't answer me. During the conversation, Mr. Dorr warned me not to directly say out Adam's full name, otherwise, it would be detected and the conversation would be discovered. I had an inkling why as I laughingly asked him that didn't he just say Adam's full name. Mr. Dorr said it didn't matter. This is because the Apprentice Pathways Sequence 4 is called Secret Sorcerer. It has the meaning of maintaining secrecy, and although it's inferior to the Servant of Concealment, it's enough for him to block any detection at his level. I asked another few questions regarding the deities, but Mr. Dorr didn't answer. All he said was that when I had the ability and opportunity, I could head above the moon to take a look. I would then understand many things. This is somewhat in line with some of my previous thoughts, but I'm suspecting if he is luring me there to get a chance to return to the real world. After all, his appearance each time is related to the moon. As long as Mr. Dorr appears, there will be plenty of information, usually covering an entire page. His explanation of the level of strength that Kings of Angels have does match my theories. The generalized meaning of King of Angels implicitly refers to a quasi-deity who exceeds Sequence 1 by using a variety of means, but they have yet to reach the level of a Sequence 0. This includes accommodating the uniqueness or consuming additional Sequence 1 potions. The simplified meaning of King of Angels will point out to the Creator who the City of Silver worships, the 8 kings of all the angels that are ruled by the ancient Sun God. Of course, they must also fulfill the general definition. Thoughts rapidly flashed through Klein's mind. As for Roselle's theory about the ancient Sun God, he was in strong agreement. He believed that the Creator who the City of Silver worshipped had reclaimed too many authorities of the ancient gods, causing him to show signs of chaos and insanity. Hence, he decisively gave birth to 2 sons to eliminate a portion of the waste. To put it simply, Amon and Adam are freebies that come with drinking potions. From the looks of it, Angel of Imagination, Adam, clearly possesses the uniqueness of the spectator pathway. He is likely the mysterious leader of the Twilight Hermit Order. Since ancient times, he has been interfering with the direction of the times in order to revive his father. I wonder if he has advanced to sequence 0. Even if he hasn't, the number of angels the Twilight Hermit Order can mobilize probably exceeds my imagination. Oh, Secret Sorcerer actually has the meaning of keeping secrets, as well as the implications of concealment. Klein instantly recalled the symbol on the back of the Fool's chair. It was the pupil-less eye, a symbol representing secrecy, and the contorted lines that represented change. He quickly reined in his thoughts and flipped to the third diary page. November 28. I dreamed of Grimm again. He was the smartest among my subordinates, but unfortunately, he died in the fog sea due to some unknown infection while exploring that nameless island. He didn't even leave a child behind. Back then, I knew that the nameless island hid secrets with unimaginable danger, but due to my lacking strength, all I could do was hold back. The dream this time is likely a result of my spirituality reminding me that I can explore that island, grasp its secrets, and completely resolve Grimm's matter. November 29. I summoned 3 subordinates, and with Benjamin Abraham's help and some searching, I finally found that nameless island again. I didn't directly enter, and I decided to rest for a day along its periphery. Edward said that he also often dreams of Grimm, feeling a deep sense of guilt for not having managed to save him back then. This is not your responsibility, but my problem. That was what I said to Edwards because I'm their leader. November 30. We ventured deep into the island. Existing here were beyonder creatures that large sources of data claim that they have gone extinct. They gathered there without any conflict, as though they were consecrating something. This bunch of beyonder creatures without any intelligence appeared to be holding some ritual. They were praying to an unknown deity. In the ritual, I saw Grimm. Chapter 767, Passing a Message. Grimm, who got infected on the Nameless Island and was undeniably deceased, appeared once again on the Nameless Island. Emperor, when did you start writing horror stories? Also, where's the rest? Klein's gaze froze onto the last line of the third diary page, and he discovered that there wasn't any new information. Apart from that, he was similarly alarmed by Emperor Rosel's description of the Beyonder creatures' strange gathering and their worship of an unknown entity. One had to understand that not all Beyonder creatures had intelligence and could be communicated with. Many of them were monsters who had lost control or had madness as an innate property. And these monsters that had lost control were gathered together, worshipping some unknown existence. Unfortunately, the Emperor didn't leave behind the coordinates of the Nameless Island. However, even if he had recorded it, I wouldn't dare to head over, for fear of any infection. If I were to die only to be revived on the island, that would be troublesome. I'll need to be at least a sequence 4 or even a sequence 3 before I'll have what it takes to explore it. As Klein thought, he made the diary in his hand vanish. He then turned to look at Katlia and asked with a smile, "What's your request?" Katlia asked without even thinking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I wish to know if Emperor Rosel once participated in a very secretive and very ancient organization." Very secretive and very ancient. Twilight Hermit Order? Emperor Rosel used to be a member of it? Audrey suddenly recalled Mr. Fool's previous mention of that organization. Alger recalled the corresponding matter and remembered that in Miss Justice's description of the Desire Apostle case in Backlund, there was a mysterious organization mentioned. Back then, Mr. Fool had told the members not to say the organization's name in the outside world, because any mention of it will be known. Such an organization does match Emperor Rosel's status. Alger nodded inwardly. As for Klein, he thought of something else. Queen Mystic's choice of diary pages are vague. She isn't able to accurately and precisely ask questions based on the content. It also means that she roughly knows that diary pages from certain periods are very important with key information within them, or she is able to discern Roselle's emotions from when it was written. As for Ma'am Hermit's question, it didn't pose any problems for Klein. He smiled and said, yes. At the same time, he silently warned himself, in the future, I need to be careful that Queen Mystic's questions might be completely unrelated to the diary pages she hands over. Thankfully, I've read quite a number of Roselle's diary, and I have quite a good understanding of the Emperor. After saying that, he added and said with a smile, it's your turn. He didn't directly mention the Twilight Hermit Order, wishing that he could answer another question based on this topic in the future. Katlia bowed and expressed her gratitude before looking at the magician. I wish to obtain clues regarding the direct descendants of the Abraham family. 1,000 pounds. She had no psychological burden when it came to offering a price, as Queen Mystic could definitely provide compensation for her. Why did you directly look at me? She already knows that my teacher is a member of the Abraham family? Furs was first alarmed before realizing that it was nothing surprising. This was because this matter wasn't a secret to the other members of the Tarot Club apart from Ma'am Hermit. It was very normal for them to mention it after completing a transaction with her. Although 1,000 pounds was very attractive, Furs didn't plan on selling information on her teacher. In all her life, there were only a handful of people who had been truly sincere to her, therefore, she cherished such relationships. After some deliberation, Furs asked, why are you looking for them? If you can provide a reason, I can pass the message. As for any further developments, it will depend on them. I have no say on those matters. Indeed, she might appear ordinary, but she actually conceals many secrets. She's a lady who's cautious and meticulous. Katlia sighed inwardly as she said with a nod, that's very reasonable. I'm searching for the direct descendants of the Abraham family in the hopes of obtaining information on Mr. Dorr. Pass this message to them and see if there's a chance for cooperating. Well, just for passing on the message, I'll pay you 350 pounds. If they're willing to take up the matter, I'll pay another 650 pounds. Furs held back for a full second before answering, deal. After saying that, she came to realize the hidden meaning behind Ma'am Hermit's words. Mr. Dorr is related to the Abraham family? That's right. My bracelet came from Ma'am Elisa, and it came from the Abraham family. Yes, teacher still doesn't know that I'm aware he's part of the Abraham family. I can only casually mention it in my letters that someone was searching for the direct descendants of the Abraham family at a particular gathering, and that it has something to do with Mr. Dorr. I wonder what kind of reaction teacher will have. At this point, Miss Justice was happy for her friend, sensing that her friend had escaped the predicament of being broke. Furs is already sequence 7. She has almost caught up to me. I have to become a hypnotist as soon as possible. As she had such thoughts, she glanced at the Tarot Club members, wishing that they had clues to the fruit of an illusory chime tree. Miss Justice's gaze really makes it hard to say no. Furs lowered her head in embarrassment. This was because she had yet to obtain any clues regarding the fruit of an illusory chime tree in her circles. Sitting across from Audrey, Alger thought for 2 seconds and said, I have clues, but it will take 2 weeks before I can obtain it. He did have clues. A long time ago, he had discovered an illusory chime tree when he entered the primitive island with Kalangos. But due to his lacking strength, he didn't attempt to approach it. And now, he had the chance of advancing to sequence 5. He naturally didn't want to give up any opportunities for making money. After all, he still owed Admiral of Stars for the information of the Obninsks. As for why he was mentioning it now, in a sense, it was to declare his rights. When the time came, he and the world would explore together. It was best to decide the splitting of the spoils ahead of time to prevent any conflict. Of course, when dealing with the illusory chime tree, it was likely that Gehrman Sparrow would idly stand at the side without rendering any assistance. No problem. Audrey was delighted, and she didn't even ask for a price. She was already beginning to consider finding an excuse or a reason to directly buy it from the psychology alchemists after returning to Backlund in June. With the 2 transactions coming to an end, due to none of the other members having any requests for the time being, Katlia repeated her search for the blood of a mythical creature, and Emlyn once again mentioned that he was searching for the remaining 4 believers of the primordial moon. Then, the tarot gathering entered the free exchange segment. Derek very naturally said, "I've already become a notary." "You don't have to tell us that." The hanged man had the urge to facepalm, but he replied with a calm voice, "Although a notary will receive a massive boost in one's physical attributes, it's still more of a support role. If the notarization of a power is valid, you'll have them temporarily enhanced. If the notarization is invalid, the beyonder powers will be forcefully dispersed. At the same time, a notary is good at creating contracts. Once a signature is provided as confirmation, even a sequence 5 cannot violate it. Even if a sequence 4 demigod tries to forcefully violate the contract, they will have to pay quite a price. As a member of the Church of Storms, it was one of the basics for him to know the strengths and weaknesses of the Sun pathway. Therefore, Alger carefully explained the exact situation for Little Sunday. He also reminded him to select a mystical item that was good at controlling a target. If there wasn't any, it was best to select something with powerful offensive strength. "Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man," Derek thanked him from the bottom of his heart. Deep down, in the entire tarot club, he felt that the greatest and most respectable person was Mr. Fool, and the most impressive person to strive for as a role model was Mr. World. And the most reliable and kind person was none other than wise Mr. Hanged Man. Towards this, Emlyn thought, "This fellow has actually caught up to me. No, I can't be surpassed by him. I need to complete the hunting competition as soon as possible to get the rewards." He contemplated for a few seconds, and after receiving Mr. Fool's permission, he conjured the thin moon puppet that resembled a wooden pole. "Ladies and gentlemen, does any one of you know what this is?" He knew that Mr. Fool was definitely aware of the answer, but he temporarily didn't have anything he could use for an equal exchange with this mighty existence. Therefore, he could only rely on the other members of the Tarot Club for any answers. "Isn't this the puppet I saw at that gathering?" Mr. Moon already found his target. Furs similarly waited for others to give an answer out of curiosity. Katlia carefully observed it before frowning. "It's likely a moon envoy. It's a beyonder item that primordial moon believers create by using a bloody ritual that spans centuries. It's said to be imbued with divine powers. Each one of them possesses an unimaginable horror. Where did you obtain it from? It's very dangerous. It's best that you hand it over to the upper echelons of the Sanguine." Emlyn changed his sitting posture and chuckled. "I encountered it when hunting the primordial moon believer. She's already dead, while I'm still alive." Mr. Moon's flaunting of himself is really obvious. The senior spectator, Audrey, chuckled inwardly. Katlia was taken aback. Without deliberately hiding anything, she asked, "How did you do it? Did the upper echelons of the Sanguine provide you with assistance?" Emlyn gaped, somewhat at a loss for words. Only then did he realize that this topic wasn't suitable for a deeper discussion. Ahem. He cleared his throat and looked towards the end of the long bronze table. "I sought help from Mr. Fool." Chapter 768, Conversation Between Smart People Sought Help from Mr. Fool? "You can do that?" Katlia was stunned by what she heard. Having been punished and discovering that his blessed Gehrman Sparrow was becoming more and more impressive, she no longer had any doubts regarding Mr. Fool's status or abilities. She even knew that when Mr. Fool pulled her in through the use of an ancient item, allowing her to escape the pursuit of knowledge, she had come to realize that he was in existence at least at the level of the hidden sage or primordial moon. However, for certain reasons, he wasn't able to interfere with the real world, making her suspect him to be an ancient god that was undergoing an awakening process. The moon's words left her surprised that Mr. Fool was able to provide substantial help to the Tarot Club members, and wasn't just someone who could only provide knowledge or pull them above the gray fog. On the one hand, this means that in times of danger, I can also pray directly to Mr. Fool for help. This is more ridiculous than any ritual. On the other hand, it reveals the fact that Mr. Fool's recovery process is faster than I had imagined. Many thoughts instantly flashed through Katlia's mind. Audrey, Derek, and company weren't that surprised. They had more or less sought Mr. Fool's help in the past, and they had even witnessed the angel under this great existence. Seeing everyone's gaze fall on him, Emlyn shrank his neck as he lifted his chin. I paid a price. It was a fair and equal exchange. Fair and equal exchange. A mighty existence's immediate and effective response is priceless. Katlia couldn't help but retort inwardly. She didn't directly say it, because she too wished to use the opportunity of such a fair and equal exchange in the future. It would imply that she would have an additional life compared to others. Furs was quite puzzled by Mr. Moon's deliberate emphasis on the principle of fair and equal exchange. Everyone who had sought Mr. Fool's help had made a corresponding payment. Mr. Moon sure is a man who cares about his reputation, no, a sanguine. Audrey seriously evaluated Emlyn's emotional changes that happened over a span of seconds. As the exchange continued, the tarot gathering slowly came to an end. After returning to the City of Silver, Derek first recalled a notary's strengths and weaknesses mentioned by Mr. Hanged Man. Then, he once again headed for the Twin Towers that was north of the city to select a mystical item. He didn't do this before, because his condition wasn't stable after advancing. He was worried that making contact with a mystical item would lead to him losing control. Inside the spire, Derek Berg listed his requirements after finishing the paperwork. He saw a filtered list of items and obtained the corresponding documents that contained the information. After having a careful read and observation period, he quickly narrowed down the choices to two. The first was Cardi's ring. It was ancient and simple in appearance, and it was completely iron black in color. It was engraved with dark and complicated patterns. It was left behind by a resident of the City of Silver a long time ago. It could aid the wearer in awing a target, causing them to stop. It could also make ordinary humans temporarily lose their reason, or it could awaken the hidden emotions and memories of a crazy monster, allowing them to enter a brief period of confusion in which they wouldn't deliver any attacks. The other item was Thunder God's Roar. It was obtained from a city that was in ruins. It was rather heavy and resembled a sledgehammer. It was dark blue in color while silver lightning swirled around it. Holding its handle felt like holding the leg bone of a creature. It could produce sounds that left the enemy in fear and chaos while in combat, as though a thunder god had descended upon the ground as he kept roaring. Every strike brought with it a potent destructiveness with no lack of terrifying lightning. The negative effect of Cardi's ring was that the wearer would unknowingly produce another self. Therefore, one needed to periodically receive treatment from a psyche analyst. If there were any missed treatments, then it could result in the aggravation of the problem, making it harder to treat. And eventually, the two selves would enter a fight, ultimately leading to losing control. In contrast, Thunder God's Roar didn't have that many latent risks. It would only make the user be a little irascible bit by bit. As long as one periodically vented their emotions, there wouldn't be a problem. However, it also had another side effect. In a completely dark environment, the chances of being attacked by terrifying monsters from the depths of darkness was 100%. The chances of being attacked is 100%. Upon seeing this number, Derek turned gloomy. This meant that many City of Silver residents had vanished because of this reason. They were the former owners of Thunder God's Roar. Which should I choose? Generating another self is terrifying. Miss Justice has mentioned before that it's called dissociative identity disorder. Thunder God's Roar not only has a power that affects the enemy's state, but it also has a rather powerful offensive capability. My axe of hurricane has been used too many times, so it will likely be damaged ahead of time. I can produce light by myself, so I don't have to be worried about absolute darkness. Derek thought for a moment and pointed at the dark blue sledgehammer. I want Thunder God's roar. 160 Buckland Street. Klein walked out of his master bedroom and saw butler Walter waiting for him with a few invitation letters in hand. Sir, there are a total of 3 invitations this week. There's an afternoon tea session on Wednesday, a literary salon on Friday, and a banquet on Saturday. They were sent from. Klein listened with a warm expression before saying with a smile, "Tell these friendly inviters that I'll be participating." "All right, sir." Walter bowed and left the 3rd story. Seeing the figure disappear from the stairwell, Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. After another week of such invitations, it will be my turn to invite my neighbors for a banquet or a ball. By repeating this act of inviting others and being invited, I'll really enter their circles and would be recommended by them to important figures at even higher levels. I'll be able to enter different clubs. Heh, such recommendations are definitely established on a foundation of having sufficient wealth. A person without any value wouldn't be recommended. Socializing for high society is truly troublesome. It'll take at least another month before I'll get to make contact with people who were slightly involved in the great smog of Backland. The church is easier. As long as there's enough donations and enough piousness, I'll be able to freely enter and exit to listen to the bishop's preachings. Of course, that's on the premise I pass the investigation. If everything goes well, I'll be able to figure out the rotation schedule of the keepers and find a chance to go behind Cheney's gate. Klein reined in his thoughts as he instructed his valet, Richardson, to bring him his coat, hat, and cane. According to his schedule, he was to head to the Royal Grand Theatre to see the most popular play, The Betrayer's Ring, in recent times. This isn't solely for entertainment. It's to understand the popular plays, famous music, and trending novels. Only then could he have a common topic of conversation at the various high society gatherings. Being a popular gentleman must be tiring. Behind a 1-minute performance lies 10 years of hard work. Social gatherings such as these are really exhausting. As Klein lampooned, he allowed Richardson to help him wear a coat before he sat in his high-end 4-wheeled carriage. He headed for the Royal Grand Theatre in Westborough, where he had a luxurious box to himself, and watched The Betrayer's Ring. It's different from television and movies. A play's acting is more exaggerated and impactful. Yes, this is determined by the acting environment. The story isn't bad. But why does it seem familiar? Don't tell me that it's a story adapted from Emperor Rozel's works. These are likely famous play actors. The papers have mentioned them before. It's said that they're very popular, just like celebrities on Earth during the age of the Internet. As long as I participate in the gatherings of high society, I'll definitely have the opportunity of meeting them. As Klein watched the play, he habitually lampooned inwardly. Sherwood Borough, at the ticket booth of a large theater. Melissa, who finally had her turn, pushed the notes and coins through the booth window and said, "The Betrayer's Ring. 2 tickets. 3 p.m. on Sunday." After watching The Betrayer's Ring, Klein sat in his carriage as he sipped a cup of black tea and received the evening papers that Richardson had purchased. He first flipped through the play's critic column, and he found the comments from some professional critics. He compared their reviews to his own, and he gradually formulated a unique and profound experience. Yes, at the very least, it's enough to fool those ladies and gentlemen. After Klein finished his homework, he leisurely read the papers and was surprised to find a piece of news. The Backland Bike Company's 10% shares have been sold. Further inquiries won't be entertained. It's done. By publishing this piece of news, it means Mr. Isengard has already received the money. Klein was first delighted before he frowned slightly. His gaze landed on the exclamation mark at the end. The information was indeed what he and Isengard Stanton had agreed upon ahead of time, but he found that exclamation mark was rather harsh on the eyes. Such a statement doesn't need an exclamation mark. Mr. Isengard is a person who pays attention to details. He wouldn't give the papers free rein. He deliberately left the exclamation to pass a message. He's giving a warning? While pondering, Klein suddenly realized something. The 10% shares which Isengard Stanton sold are obviously from Sherlock Moriarty. With the former's character, he wouldn't sell it for no reason. In a certain sense, this means that Sherlock Moriarty or his proxy has returned to Backlund. Therefore, one of the factions of the royal family that was involved with the Great Smog of Backlund had acutely noticed this situation and has begun monitoring Detective Isengard Stanton, hoping to capture the person who heads over to claim the cash. How should I get the money? Klein seemed to naturally read the papers as he began seriously considering the pertinent question. Chapter 769, Sacrificing to Oneself 10 at Night. Backlund was drizzling again as a thin fog produced a blurry sense of beauty amidst the street lamps. Isengard Stanton's assistant, Bowen, surveyed the bottom level once before walking to the side of the oriel window and was prepared to shut the final window. At that moment, a shadow scuttled in and landed firmly on the protruding wall. It was a blue, short-furred stray cat. Bowen saw the large pair of yellow eyes looking at him as he couldn't help but chuckle. There's no food here. As a detective's work made him prone to revenge, and him having many secrets to hide, Isengard Stanton's cook and servants were paid by the hour. There were a fixed number of hours a day, and they wouldn't prepare too much food. This made it difficult for there to be any leftovers after dinner. The blue cat opened its mouth but didn't produce any meowing sounds. It began speaking like a human. I'm Sherlock Moriarty. I'm here to meet Mr. Isengard Stanton. Although Bowen was a Beyonder who was nurtured by the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, he was a low-sequence Beyonder and his horizons were stilted. This was the first time he was encountering a speaking cat, so he was momentarily shocked and dazed. After a few seconds, he came to his senses and recalled what the cat had just said. It said it's Sherlock Moriarty. This great detective really isn't simple. He actually changed into a cat, no, controlled a cat. Such powers are really strange and terrifying. Bowen rapidly calmed down and didn't directly answer the cat. He reached out to close the windows. After doing all of this, he said with a suppressed voice, "Follow me." The cat immediately leaped from the platform behind the oriel window as it agilely followed behind Bowen with its tail up. It followed him all the way to the second story and watched him knock on Isengard Stanton's bedroom door. "Is there something?" Isengard, who was dressed in pajamas with faint lines, opened the door and asked. He was just enjoying his tobacco before sleeping. Bowen cautiously pointed to the crouched blue cat beside him. "Mr. Sherlock Moriarty is looking for you." Isengard, with his white sideburns and thin face, raised his brows slightly and looked down. He took 2 steps back and allowed the blue cat to saunter into his bedroom. "Return to your room and get some sleep. Wake up as per normal tomorrow. We still have a case awaiting us," Isengard instructed Bowen as though nothing had happened. After his assistant left him, he closed the door and turned to look at the blue cat who was sitting beside the reclining chair. He chuckled. "I never expected you to have such Beyonder powers. I was worried you would directly come over." "I noticed your exclamation mark," the cat said with a smile. It had to be said that having such an expression show on a cat's face was rather odd. It left anyone who witnessed it feel a chill run down their back. Isengard didn't react abnormally towards that as he sucked at his pipe, sat on a reclining chair, and slowly exhaled in comfort. He said with a smile, "I trust your intelligence. Thank you for your compliments." The cat politely reached out its paws and bowed. Isengard observed it and rubbed its pipe while smiling. "You should have understood what is happening. Those people don't dare to monitor me too strictly, afraid that I would discover them and end up telling the Church of Evernight and the Church of Steam. Heh, so even though it will be quite troublesome for them if they get exposed, I believe that they have a demigod among them. This is a deduction and is also based on certain feedback. After all, I've lived on this street for years. Therefore, humans and animals wouldn't be stopped from entering my house. I believe you've already figured that out. But when leaving, you'll definitely be tailed and tracked. Do you have the means to evade their tracking? The sum of money isn't a small one. Bringing it out would be quite conspicuous. Let me think. Were you planning on conferring with me in order to get me to deposit the money into a particular bank account, and then you'll find many people to withdraw them in different parts of Backlund? Upon saying that, Isengard said with a self-deprecating smile, "This is the best solution I can think of, but carrying it out would be extremely troublesome." The cat didn't give a direct response as it gave a deep chuckle. "I only need you to lend me an empty room and 3 candles. No problem." Isengard didn't press the issue as he said, the shares were sold for £12,000. The buyer is the daughter of Earl Hall, Audrey. Well, the hiring of lawyers and accountants, as well as the publishing of the advertisements, cost a total of £600. In addition, there was a 0.5% stamp duty and 20% D-type taxes. So at the end of the day, there's only £8,940 left. D-type taxes were a tax on commercial, financial, and specialized income. There's tax. More than £2,000 are gone just like that. The cat's expression instantly froze. Klein was formerly a nighthawk, and his salary was tax-free. Later, as a private detective, his income was difficult to be monitored, so he never declared his income for tax purposes. Later, he became an adventurer, and since the bounties targeted at pirates enjoyed concessions, there was no need for him to pay taxes on them. Hence, he never realized that tax was something he needed to pay. Therefore, back when Isengard Stanton had mentioned taxes, he hadn't taken it to heart, believing that it wouldn't be much. However, reality had given him a heavy beating. As for why there weren't any taxes for the share transaction the previous time, taxes were waived by the lone government for initial investments related to inventions, as a way to foster inventions. After a brief silence, the cat's whiskers moved as it said, "All right, give me the cash. Move it to the empty room. There's no problems with the money, right? I've already checked them. They wouldn't do any cheap tricks on that, as it would be an insult to my intelligence." Isengard stood up with his pipe. "Remember to send me a signed letter of confirmation by mail later." "It's already on its way," the cat replied, prepared. Isengard walked to the safe inside the master bedroom, using a passcode and key to open it. Then, he took out stacks of cash, and he stuffed them into different briefcases. Following that, he left the master bedroom with these briefcases and entered a guest room diagonally opposite the master bedroom. "Check it." Isengard placed the briefcases filled with cash on the ground as he said to the cat that followed him in. "I trust you," the cat said after taking a few glances. Isengard nodded and pointed to the cabinet. "There are candles inside." With that said, he left the door, held the doorknob, and said with a smile, "I'm really curious how you would leave. I believe it will be a very exciting magic show." Isengard Stanton closed the door with a click, leaving the guest room silent and bleak. At the cat's side, a figure dressed in a dark red coat and an old triangular hat appeared. It was none other than Klein's marionette, Wraith Senior. He found the candles and quickly set up a simple altar. Skipping over many of the first few steps, he directly muttered in Elvish, "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rorstad archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take his offerings. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom. The wind inside the wall of spirituality suddenly grew in intensity as Senor quickly sliced the back of his hand and threw out a few drops of blood. As a sequence 5 wraith, everything on him was material that was rich in spirituality. The strong winds sucked up the blood, howling as it drilled into the candle flame that symbolized sea god Calvetua. The flame burgeoned, forming an illusory door filled with magic labels and symbols. After about 10 seconds, the door let out a heavy creak as it slowly opened. One by one, Senor lifted up the briefcases filled with money and threw them into the illusory door. When there was almost none left, the gold coin he stored in his body flew out and landed on the altar. The wraith's figure then disappeared, projecting onto the smooth side of the gold coin. The gold coin trembled as it flew up, hitched a ride on the briefcase ahead of it, and entered the illusory door of sacrifice. Silently, the mysterious door closed as the 3 candlelight were restored to normal. At this moment, the blue, short-furred cat seemed to recover its senses. It looked around blankly as it meowed. After a while, Isengard opened the door and entered, finding all the briefcases with the cash gone. There were only 3 candles burning silently as the blue short-furred cat was warily arching its back at him. While he scrutinized this scene, a rental carriage slowly drove past on the fork on the other end of the street. On the same night, in a building inside Sherwood Borough, Zio returned home under the drizzle. As she wiped her hair with a towel, she said to Furs, "Your letter has been mailed." Furs tersely answered as she began to guess when her teacher would respond. At this moment, Zio put down the towel and quipped, "There's news about Mr. X's gathering. It'll still be at the same place on Friday night." "Great. I can tell Mr. World. I wonder how much I'll need to pay." Furza's eyes lit up when she heard that. Before she could ask about the details, Zio added, "Mr. X also gave a mission that's said to have handsome rewards." It's to inform him of people around them who have abnormal luck." "People with abnormal luck?" Furs muttered in puzzlement. Is this man's brain working? Who would divulge things around them at such a gathering? This will make it easy for others to discover their true identities. Who knows? Perhaps he really is a lunatic. Zio didn't know anyone with abnormal luck, so she answered without much thought. Furs carefully thought for a moment, but she failed to figure out the true intentions behind this mission. All she could do was throw it to the back of her mind. She planned on praying to Mr. Fool once Zio went to take a bath, passing the relevant information to the World Gehrman Sparrow. Chapter 770, A Child Should Act Like a Child. Mr. X is looking for people with abnormal luck? Above the gray fog, Klein ruminated over the information Miss Magician had provided, in an attempt to analyze anything of use. After thinking to no avail, he decided to approach it from another angle. He first recalled the people who had abnormal luck around him to see if there were any connections. The Fog Sea's strongest hunter Anderson Hood counts as one. Dr. Aaron Series is another. Both of them were affected by one of the snakes of fate. Angel of Fate Ouroboros was one of the creators of Rose Redemption. This secret organization supports and believes the true creator. The Aurora Order is equivalent to the true creator's church. A series of circumstances surfaced in Klein's mind as he quickly came to a conclusion. This is Angel of Fate Ouroboros's attempt to search for Snake of Fate Will Osepton. He is driving the members of the Aurora Order to help him find Snake of Mercury Will Osepton. And this implies that behind Mr. X, there's a king of angels existing somewhere in Backlund. Under such circumstances, assassinating Mr. X will be equivalent to having a death wish. It's no wonder Mr. X doesn't care about the uniqueness of Backlund. The official factions would at most imagine that he has a saint backing him. In the official dossiers, the Aurora Order only has 5 saints. This way, they will respond in the wrong manner. After Klein made the judgment, the first thought he had was to decline Miss Magician's request, and also to warn her not to provoke Mr. X. If it wasn't because sounding the alarm might affect Snake of Mercury Wuxia, while the Church of the Evernight Goddess clearly had records of Dr. Aaron Sirius's bout of bad luck, Klein would have gotten Miss Magician to report both the Angel of Fate Ouroboros and Mr. X to a particular church. He calmly thought for another few seconds and conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow, making him pray in the grey fog. "I'll confirm the situation and give you a reply tomorrow." He didn't directly reject her commission, as he planned on first asking Snake of Mercury Wuxia. He then immediately returned to the real world, and he carefully took out the extremely fragile paper crane from his wallet before gently unfolding it. Klein wasn't in a rush to write anything. Instead, he first recalled the various questions he needed to consult Will on. After thinking up a draft, he got out a pencil and sharpened it with a blade. After stretching his muscles, Klein wrote, "The members of the Aurora Order are searching for people with abnormal luck. I wonder if you know how to use the Worm of Time to create charms. Does your placenta blood count as a mythical creature's blood? If it does, I hope to obtain 1 drop. What price would I have to offer?" Klein had originally planned on asking Wuxia how he was able to maintain his rationality. After all, the Church's information indicated that there had been no public faith in the Snake of Fate. However, he ultimately curbed himself from doing that, afraid that Wuxia in his infant state replied, "How did you conceive the notion that I'm rational?" That way, he had no idea if Will was joking or speaking the truth. Although there's no organization that believes in the Snake of Fate, there are certain areas that believe in the God of Luck. It's considered a traditional custom. Perhaps they are an alternative identity of Wuxia or Ouroboros. Klein mumbled silently and used the best of his clown abilities before managing to refold the paper crane. He then placed it underneath his pillow. After doing all of that, he had the time to calculate how much cash he had. 17,046 pounds, 5 gold coins, 3 soldi, and 8 pence in change. If I had assets like a house, manor, and company shares, having so many liquid assets would make me quite a tycoon in Backland. Of course, I'm still very far from being a top tycoon. To reach them, one's overall assets need to be £1 million. As Klein was glad that he had quite a bit of money, he recalled his debt, as well as the large investments that he needed to make in order to develop his persona's image. He then drank a mouthful of water, got into bed, and covered himself with a light but warm blanket before he slowly fell asleep. Amidst his reverie, Klein suddenly snapped awake and saw the desolate black plains. He walked all the way to the pitch-black steeple in the middle of the plains, passing through the chaotic and abnormal layout before coming deep into the steeple. Like before, there was a circle of tarot cards on the ground. However, the protruding area in the middle of the tarot cards didn't have any silvery lines written. Wuxia didn't give a reply. Then why did he pull me into this dream? Amidst Klein's puzzlement, he suddenly saw a black baby pram roll out of the shadows. In it was an infant whose looks were indiscernible while it was wrapped in silver silk. "Mr. Snake of Fate?" Klein politely and cautiously asked. The infant immediately said in a clear voice, "What makes you so sure it's a mister? Isn't that determined from your name? Don't mind such details." Klein lampooned and relaxed due to the attitude he was given. "Then, how may I address you?" Wuxia in baby form tersely answered as it said, "Stumped, I haven't decided." "As you know, you don't. Every time I start again, I try to make myself a little different, so as to maintain a good mental state. A child should act like a child while they're a child." Klein's heart stirred when he heard that. Is this the way the monster pathway maintains its reasoning so as to resist madness? In the black pram, Wuxia replied briskly, "Yes, every beginning washes away the madness. However, it still needs certain anchoring from faith, otherwise, I wouldn't be able to maintain my state as a sequence one for too long." Compared to before, you're becoming more and more knowledgeable. Apart from anchoring oneself with faith, there are other ways to resist the madness. However, restarting is clearly an ability of sequence 1 snake of fate of the monster pathway. Other Beyonder pathways aren't able to emulate that. Mr. Azek is constantly losing his memories and repeatedly finding himself. Does it also involve the same concept? Klein nodded in thought as he made every second count by asking, I suspect Ouroboros is searching for you through the Aurora Order members. Will Oseptin scoffed. I've been playing hide-and-seek with him for a very long time. He isn't good at such matters. It's quite obvious that he doesn't have a childhood. Every time he restarts, he grows up beside the true creator. He lacks the psychological experience of the different stages in life, causing him to be very crazy at times, but of course, he doesn't mind. I did inform Ricardo to use the die of probability in certain places and leave marks. This will mess up Ouroboros's judgment. He will soon leave Backlund once again. That means there's still chance of assassinating Mr. X. Yes, when the time comes, I'll divine the level of danger above the gray fog. Klein didn't continue on this topic as he asked, do you know how to use the Worm of Time to create charms? Will Oseptin didn't directly answer and instead returned with a question, you obtained a Worm of Time from Palaz Zoroast? How did you know? Klein was taken aback as he asked. He wasn't surprised that Will Oseptin had managed to mention the origins of the Worm of Time. After all, there weren't many demigods in the Marauder pathway who could create avatars, but why hadn't he assumed that it was Blasphemer Amon? The latter could also leave behind a Worm of Time. Will Oseptin smiled and said, Palaz Zoroast isn't in good condition, and he had to parasitize your former colleague. Ah right, your former colleague was investigating Sherlock Moriarty, and he had entered my house in the middle of the night. I sensed that there was something problematic about him and had given him a short period of bad luck, causing him to encounter other demigods hidden in Backlund. And when he was in danger, Palaz Zoroast had taken action. It would have been fine even if he hadn't taken action. It's only a prank. I would have given your former colleague sufficient good luck at the critical moment. Leonard is investigating Sherlock Moriarty? The grandpa in his body is called Palaz Zoroast. Klein frowned slightly, unsure where the problem stemmed from. Will Oseptin continued, the creation of a Worm of Time charm isn't too difficult for you. You can pray to that uniqueness trait about you and use a compound of mercury and pure silver as a medium to draw the corresponding symbols. It's not too difficult. Pray to the Fool? That's right. The mysterious space above the gray fog clearly has a form of attraction to the Marauder pathway. Klein was thrilled as he felt like he had grasped something. At this moment, Will smiled and added, as for what the corresponding symbol is, I've no idea. What a huge reversal. Klein couldn't help but twitch the corner of his lips. When he noticed that Will Oseptin wasn't speaking any further, he hurriedly smiled and said, there's another question. About your placenta blood. Before he could finish his sentence, Will suddenly opened his mouth and let out a cry. Wah! He began wailing like a real infant. Can't we talk normally? Klein froze in his spot. If he hadn't already confirmed it, he really would have suspected whether the entity before him was a Sequence 1, the president of the Life School of Thought. All right. I just wanted to ask if it's the blood of a mythical creature, Klein said as he raised his hands midway. Will stopped crying and said with a laugh, of course, but I'll swap it ahead of time. Otherwise, everyone will die on the spot. He paused for a moment before saying, if you can give me something suitable, it's not impossible to give you one drop. All right, goodbye. Just as Will Oseptin said that, Klein felt the steeple shake as the dream rapidly shattered. Soon, he woke up. Chapter 771, Luck Siphon. What item would a snake of fate be interested in? Klein slowly sat up and leaned against a pillow. He thought for some time and decided to consider it at a later date. After all, he was still at least a month away from Will Oseptin's birth. He could also leave the question for the hermit Catlia and Queen Mystic Bernadette, who was backing her, to rack their brains over. Of course, Klein didn't eliminate the possibility of Will Septon's sudden choice of having an early birth. He slowly turned his attention into creating a Worm of Time charm. According to Will Septon's explanation, he had most of the conditions required, but he was just short of the corresponding symbol. Pray to the Fool and use the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog. I wonder if a symbol corresponding to the Marauder pathway would work. Even if it does, I don't know what it is. Unless I pull a Marauder above the gray fog and let the high-back chair produce the corresponding pattern. As Klein thought about the details, he suddenly had an idea. In that case, perhaps he could try the symbol behind the Fool's chair. It was the pupil-less eye, a symbol representing secrecy, and the contorted lines that represented change. I wonder if it will work. Divination won't be able to rule it out by elimination, but I can predict if the attempt will be successful. Besides, even if it fails, it shouldn't be too big a problem. After all, I'm praying to myself. Even if the material were to be wasted in the experiment, it would enter above the gray fog and not be lost. With this in mind, Klein felt pumped. He couldn't help but get out of bed to try out the experiment that very night. A material like the Worm of Time that's left behind by a Marauder demigod at Amon's level still has its essence and level even if it's dead. When using it for a charm, it might not reach the level of an angel for various reasons, but it wouldn't be too far off. It'll be about the peak strength of a saint. If Klein succeeded, it would be equivalent to having an additional trump card. At critical points in time, it might give him an additional life. So how could he not be excited and expectant? I can only stir some of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog. The level of the Worm of Time charm will likely drop a little more. But regardless, it will definitely be like the 9th law given to me by Admiral Amirius. If I use the Blatherer's aura to create a high-level charm in the Devil domain, it will likely be at the level of the 9th law. Unfortunately, I wouldn't dare to pray to the dark side of the universe. Klein wore his pajamas as he stood barefooted. He took 4 steps counterclockwise on a thick carpet as he chanted the incantation before entering above the gray fog. Sitting at the Fool's seat at the end of the long bronze table, he conjured a dark red fortune teller and yellowish-brown goatskin. He wrote down the corresponding divination statement: "The charm I'm about to begin making will be successful." Unwinding the spirit pendulum from his wrist, Klein held it with his left hand and entered the state of cogitation. After repeating the divination statement 7 times, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz spinning counterclockwise at a rather slow speed and ordinary amplitude. This means that it will succeed. But that begs the question, will it successfully verify that the symbol I use is effective, or successfully verify that it doesn't work? As an experienced seer, Klein attempted to interpret the revelation, but he failed to obtain any confirmation. With regards to that, he could only decide to experiment. There was no way for him to eliminate the mistakes if he didn't do so. Right on the heels of that, Klein wrote a new divination statement: "The assassination of Mr. X this Friday will be dangerous." This time, the topaz pendant continued spinning clockwise at a faster frequency and greater amplitude. There's significant danger, but it doesn't reach the level of a demigod's participation, much less that of a king of angels. If it involves an existence of that level, he will definitely sense my divination and resist it. From the looks of it, Angel of Fate Ouroboros will soon be led out of Backlund. This means that the danger itself is a result of Mr. X and his subordinates. It's within the limits of what I can handle. As long as I don't make a mistake, the chances of success are pretty high. Klein made a judgment, put down the pen and paper, and returned to the real world. As a mysticism expert who often created charms, he had no lack of common materials. He immediately got out some candles and lit them on the table. Following that, he set up a simple altar against the glow of dusk. He then used a piece of silver to draw out the combined symbol that represented the Fool. As Klein didn't know what path number the Fool represented or what magic labels there were, he could only ensure that both sides remained equal. According to the books of charms he had read, these would similarly satisfy the rules of mysticism, but the corresponding might would be reduced. The chances of failure would rise because the existence that one was praying to could consider it as being irreverent and not pious enough. Of course, it wasn't a problem for Klein since he wouldn't reject himself. After completing the act of carving the symbol, Klein found a metal bottle and used his spirituality together with a container, and he then poured the mercury out and filled the carved-out pattern. This time, he decided to complete only the front side for now. He would then summon himself and respond to himself. He would then bring the worm with the 12 translucent rings back to the room and then place it on a silver sheet. After doing all of this, Klein adjusted the altar and took 2 steps back. He then said in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Following the process, he completed the necessary steps before taking 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the space above the gray fog. After imbuing himself with the Black Emperor card, he used his spirituality to stir a tiny amount of the powers above the gray fog to respond to his prayers. While the surging energy poured into the circle of light, Klein didn't hesitate to return to the real world. He saw the altar had turned dark and gloomy, as though there were countless secrets hidden here. And the silver sheet had already floated up, fusing with the worm of time's corpse. Klein took 2 steps forward, flipped the silver sheet around, and he filled the carved symbol on the back with mercury. As the lines lit up, they effused a hazy luster. Klein rapidly retracted his arms and saw the luster grow richer. He then enveloped the silver sheet and the worm of time's corpse inside. Suddenly, the darkness around the altar distorted as the entire space seemed to turn abnormal. This change disappeared as fast as it came. The charms filled with strange patterns slowly landed on the desk. It was entirely translucent in color and was dark black. It was like a miniature card made out of a special crystal. It also resembled the eyes of a particular existence that was watching this world. It succeeded. It really works. Klein was delighted as he hurriedly picked up the charm. He found it cold to the touch as if he was touching snow. Regardless of the resulting effects of the charm, just its formation had meant a success. Klein had once again obtained a high-level charm at the demigod level. He busied himself again, bringing the completed item above the gray fog. He then used dream divination to figure out how to use it. The charm, which was in the shape of a black crystal card, had only one effect, but it was highly potent. It was to siphon off the luck of others. And to be precise, it was to graft fate. A period of the target's fate would be grafted onto the user. The simplest situation would be when an enemy is about to kill me, I'll use this charm, siphoning off his fate of surviving, as well as grafting the fate of impending death onto them. Then, the situation would be developed into him clearly succeeding, only for him to die. It does match the Marauder pathway's usual traits, but it's more sinister and terrifying. It's going from stealing wealth to stealing fate. If the Worm of Time were alive, and I was able to fully employ the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, this charm might even point towards the domain of time. As Klein thought, he felt a sense of fear. If it wasn't for the assistance that this mysterious space had given him by obstructing and purging things, he had no way to deal with a Worm of Time. Phew, now it's mine. I can't call it a Worm of Time anymore. I'll just call it Luck Siphon. Klein once again got busy as he brought back the Luck Siphon charm to the real world. After dealing with the traces of the ritual, he gravely placed the high-level charm into the iron cigar case, putting it together with Azek's copper whistle and the Seigneur gold coin. He then sealed and isolated the case with a wall of spirituality. Being in a good mood, Klein didn't feel sleepy. He drew the curtains a little and allowed the crimson moonlight to shine in, illuminating his room with tranquility and silence. While he was enjoying the scenery, he suddenly saw a figure sneak out from Member of Parliament Mock's house as it approached amidst the shadows. It was none other than Hazel Mocked. She once again headed for the sewers, removed the manhole cover, climbed down, and didn't forget to close the cover. Why is she always heading into the sewers? It's not likely for her to be heading to other areas from here to act like a superhero in the mysterious world. After all, each trip doesn't take her more than an hour. Unless she has very reliable intelligence, it's difficult to achieve anything. Besides, this will make it easy for her to be caught by the official Beyonders. Together with the scene provided to me by Rhodes, she's likely finding something. It's very easy for her to encounter danger if she keeps heading into the sewers. Klein stood behind the curtain gap as he observed what was happening under the serene night. He didn't attempt to warn Hazel or let the wraith possess her to let her understand the dangers of the Beyonder world. Firstly, this was because he had quite a subjective view that Hazel's sense of superiority was due to a result of her lacking knowledge in mysticism, so he couldn't be sure. Secondly, he wasn't sure how she had obtained Beyonder powers and a mystical item. Warning her out of gratitude for her kind deed earlier would easily attract unwanted attention or even trouble. After enjoying an evening of peace, Klein returned to bed and slept till daybreak. Before Richardson entered, he turned into Gehrman Sparrow and prayed to the fool, "I can accept the mission, but regardless of the outcome, I want a stone from that bracelet of yours, as well as the ability to use that spell book of yours for some time. If it succeeds, all spoils of war will be mine. You can only take the target's head. If required, you will need to provide assistance." Chapter 772, Walter's abnormality. He wants a stone for my bracelet and the right to use Lamino's travels for some time. How does he know that I have those two items? I don't remember mentioning it during the tarot gatherings. After hearing Gehrman Sparrow's response, Furs was bewildered and rather shocked. It felt like he had seen through all her secrets. She tensed up as she quickly tried recalling how this information could have been leaked. Aside from Teacher, Zio, and Mr. Fool, no one knows that I have these two items, especially Lamino's travels. I haven't even used it. Mr. Fool. Mr. World appears quite strange during the tarot gatherings. He never hands over Emperor Roselle's diary pages, and he doesn't seem to put any effort into this, nor does he show any concern. He and Mr. Fool have a deeper connection. He obtains the relevant information from him. A believer or a blessed? Furs carefully thought over the matter as she grasped something, easing her horror from before. Only at this moment did she have the time and energy to consider if she could accept Gehrman Sparrow's requests. To Furs, such a price was too cheap, far lower than she had expected. Furthermore, it was reasonable. As a Beyonder who seldom went out and just stayed home writing and resting, lending Lamino's travels for some time didn't affect her safety or her need to use it. And likewise, giving one of the two remaining stones in the bracelet that allowed her to travel through the spirit world didn't cause her to lose all her trump cards. The only problem is that Mr. World seems to be willing to only try it once. If he fails, he will still take the payment. Yes, with the fact that he needs to bear the risk, that's normal. I originally imagined that I would need to help him do many things and obtain a reward from Teacher by using the trader's head to repay the debt. Furs thought calmly for a few seconds before she prayed to Mr. Fool, "Please inform Mr. World that I accept his conditions, and I will try my best to provide him assistance in the operation." He originally wished to warn Gehrman Sparrow that using the stone might result in the side effect of receiving the ravings of the full moon, but she then realized that it was apparently only something Beyonders from the apprentice pathway encountered. Regardless if it succeeds or fails, I'll obtain that stone. I'll be able to secretly leave Backlund and meet with Mr. Hanged Man to explore that primitive island. When the time comes, I'll use the spellbook to record the usage of the stone. That way, I don't have to worry about the return trip. That's unless my luck is terrible and the recording fails. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief, opened the door, and got Richardson to help him dress up. "Sir, after breakfast, your schedule is to head to the Royal Museum to see the royal family's collection exhibition. As Richardson helped his employer wear his coat, he informed him of the day's schedule. As Dwayne Dantes mastered social dancing very quickly, the number of etiquette classes in the morning went from 5 times a week to 3 times a week, allowing him to spare time for other things. And such exhibitions were definitely a hot topic of conversation in high society circles. By not going in person, it would make him appear lacking. As for heading to St. Samuel Cathedral for the bishop's preachings, Klein had consciously lowered his frequency. This wasn't because he needed to donate tens of pounds each time, but that he was afraid that heading there frequently despite having the novelty period wear off would incur suspicion. Being natural and reasonable were the core traits of his plans. Other than on a Sunday, he planned on randomly heading to church on 2 of the remaining 6 days. He wanted to rely on an even longer period of time to accumulate intelligence so as to figure out a pattern. He couldn't be impatient or in a rush. "I'm already looking forward to it." Klein looked at the dignified reflection of himself as he said to his valet with a smile. Upon thinking of St. Samuel Cathedral and the Church of Evernight, he naturally connected it to Leonard Mitchell's secret investigation of Sherlock Moriarty. He didn't understand what he was suspicious about. Is it because of Emlyn White's purchase of Tinder that drove Leonard to investigate the people related to him, or was it because of the fleeting appearances of the detective in the cases of Capim and Lenevis that made the Red Gloves who are in charge of the investigations notice something? Or could it be both? Klein thought about the clues that he had left behind and had a rough guess. He wasn't afraid that Sherlock Moriarty would be wanted by the Church of Evernight and given a bounty. After all, apart from contacting a few people that he was familiar with, the detective wasn't to appear again. He was worried that someone would discover that Sherlock Moriarty, in his early appearances, resembled Klein Moretti greatly, and as such, they would pursue the deceased former Nighthawk. In fact, it's not a problem even if they discover that. I'm no longer the clown or magician from before. There are more than a handful of demigods searching for me. Even with the high-ranking deacons of the church, there won't be any qualitative changes. Besides, Benson and Melissa truly are ordinary people. The church will definitely not involve them and disturb their lives. I wonder if they will claim the bereavement compensation back. Probably not, for there's no way they can explain it to ordinary people. Klein wasn't that worried with all the debt he was in. This was also why he was so calm when he heard Will Ossepton mention Klein Moretti's identity last night. How could a Sequence 1 angel who was good at fate-related abilities and had previously interacted with Sherlock Moriarty early on not discover the detective's origins? Even with the grey fog's obstruction that interfered with many details, Will Ossepton was definitely able to know that Sherlock Moriarty originally came from Tingen. And back in Tingen, Klein had interacted with a youth named Adamasol, who was of the monster pathway, leading him to bleed from his eyes. And if Will Ossepton were to be aware of this and make a comparison, the answer was obvious. If Leonard were to really realize Sherlock Moriarty's hidden identity, I wonder what kind of expression he would have. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he walked out the master bedroom. He went to the second floor to enjoy the breakfast his cook had prepared specially for him. Westboro, 2 Kings Avenue, Royal Museum. Klein passed through the ticket entrance with butler Walter and valet Richardson and went into the museum. The exhibition was held by the lone royal family. They showcased all kinds of collections that had historical meaning from the kingdom's founding so as to allow the public to enjoy and gain an understanding. It was a way to raise the kingdom's citizens' respect and recognition of the royal family. As a graduate from the Department of History, Klein was still rather interested in the exhibition. Many of the matters that he was very familiar with had the corresponding items appear here. They allowed him to plunge into the long and fascinating history from another angle. What left Klein somewhat puzzled was Walter's deep understanding towards most of the exhibits. He introduced them to Dwayne Dantes with extreme detail. As expected of a butler who came from an aristocratic household. Klein silently nodded. As he perused the exhibits, the trio kept encountering other visitors, and the exhibition hall was quiet and orderly, so people had to converse in whispers. When passing by an exhibit, Klein noticed Walter suddenly stop. He then glanced to his side as his expression turned complicated. As he wasn't a spectator, Klein wasn't able to interpret the actual meaning of those complicated feelings. All he could do was trace Walter's gaze towards the exhibit. Standing in front of the exhibit were a man and a woman. The man was in his 30s and wore a black suit, silk hat, and a gold-inlaid cane, looking like a gentleman of status and wealth. The woman was in a yellow dress with a golden necklace. Her overall attire was inclined towards bright colors. Mr. Butler is looking at that man. Klein instantly made the judgment as he swept his gaze past the target without anyone detecting him. He realized that the man looked rather old. His skin was dark as a result of frequent exposure to the sun. The back of his hand was like dried wood, and his fingers were extremely rough. If I didn't look at his attire, I would have believed it if someone told me he was a farmer, gardener, or carriage driver. Klein retracted his gaze as he felt a little puzzled. The reason why he noticed these details was because he had seriously considered the appearance of an ordinary person who adventured in the southern continent for extended periods of time back when he was constructing the identity of Dwayne Dantes. He believed that apart from his gaze, bearing, and natural facial features that were etched by his rich experience, Dwayne Dantes also needed to have details, such as skin that had experienced long periods of suntanning, unobvious scars, and rough but strong palms. Otherwise, it wouldn't be enough to prop up such a character's inherent traits. I have to say that from the moment I became a faceless, I'm getting more and more experienced and wise in the aspect of creating a new character. If I were to return to Earth, even without my Beyonder powers, I'll have strong acting skills. As Klein made self-deprecating comments inwardly, he saw Walter recover from his stern look as though nothing had happened. As for the man with somewhat old facial features and rough skin, he pointed at a flag inside the exhibition case. This is the flag that the Earl of Lastings, Prince Herodes Augustus, used during the White Rose War. Unfortunately, he perished in that war. However, his death was the turning point of the entire war and the reason why Lone eventually clinched victory. Look, the flag still has his blood. He's quite knowledgeable in the field of history. Klein's gaze swept towards Walter from the corner of his eye, thought for 2 seconds, and smiled. He approached the couple and interjected in a friendly manner, "I never expected such a neglected tidbit of history would be known by someone else. I originally believed that the people's understanding of the White Rose War was only limited to Lone's victory against Intis. Sir, your eruditeness leaves me amazed." To be praised in front of his female partner, the man's expression turned from a wary one to a relaxed one. A gleeful smile appeared on his face. "I'm just a person who likes history." He casually swept his gaze towards the servant of the gentleman in front of him as he suddenly frowned before easing his brows. There were remnant looks of puzzlement. Indeed, he knows Butler Walter. Klein smiled while maintaining his composure. "Hello there, I'm a merchant from Desi, Dwayne Dantes. How may I address you?" The man hesitated and said, "William Sykes, a land steward at a manor." Chapter 773, Additional Development. William Sykes. A land steward. Klein inwardly repeated the response he got before turning the topic of conversation towards the flag and the White Rose War. After a short chat, he politely bade farewell and walked towards the other exhibits with Walter and Richardson. He continued his own tour of the exhibits, as though his encounter from before was completely trivial, a conversation that was purely coincidental. When it was almost noon, Klein, who had returned to his high-end four-wheeled carriage, looked out at the passing bicycles when he suddenly said, "Walter, you seem to know Mr. William Sykes?" Walter solemnly nodded and said, "I once knew him while I was working for Viscount Conrad's household. He served a member of the royal family, the former Earl of Lastings, Prince Edisac." He didn't conceal anything, and he described William Sykes's background in detail. "He was once in service of Prince Edisac." He's living quite a good life after the prince passed away because of the great smog of Backland. I wonder what manor he's the land steward of. Perhaps he knows some secrets?" Klein gently nodded and didn't probe further. He was wondering if he should find an opportunity to investigate William Sykes. If William Sykes really knows something, the royal family's faction wouldn't leave him be. Or perhaps he is part of that faction. In short, investigating him will be a rather dangerous matter. There's no way to entrust this matter to Miss Magician, Emlyn White, or Miss Zio. Miss Sharon has the ability to do so, but this might result in destroying her peaceful life. The best solution is still to use Hero Bandit Black Emperor. But the problem is that before stealing the Antigonus family's notebook, my investigations of the great smog of Backland should only be superficial. I shouldn't alarm anyone or bring about any accidental changes. Klein appeared to admire the streets outside, but many thoughts were going through his mind. Finally, he decided to hold back for the time being unwilling to affect the most pertinent matter he had at present. After having lunch and taking a nap, Klein received classes in literary appreciation until it was almost evening. After sending away his teacher, he was just about to head to the second story's dining hall when he suddenly heard the doorbell ring. Amidst the ringing, Klein saw Richardson immediately take a few steps forward to open the door. Standing outside were two police officers in black and white checkered uniforms. From their epaulets, one of them was a high-ranking inspector, while the other was a sergeant. "Officers, how may I help you?" Richardson asked on behalf of his employer. The high-ranking inspector was a thin man and had his black hair hidden under his peaked cap. His sideburns had a little color as he swept his gaze into the house before warmly saying with a smile, "I'm here for Mr. Dwayne Dantes. There's a case that involves him and his butler." "What is it?" Klein slowly walked to the door. "I'm Dwayne Dantes." After introducing himself, he asked politely, "Officers, how may I address you? If the matter is a little more complicated and needs more time, why not come to my parlor? We can discuss it over tea." The other police officer, the sergeant, was an elegant lady. She was clearly interested in taking up the offer as she looked at the high-ranking inspector, awaiting the decision of her superior. Due to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, the lone police force had plenty of female officers, but due to the other faiths and the prevailing trends of society, they suffered some form of discrimination when it came to promotions and positions. They mostly did clerical work, and there was an invisible ceiling for their career development. The high-ranking inspector smiled and said, "There's no need for tea, but we need to question your servants." He paused before getting to the main point. "Mr. Dwayne Dantes, do you know a person by the name of William Sykes? I got to know him this morning at the Royal Museum." Klein vaguely sensed that some sort of unexpected development had occurred as he asked, "Did something happen to him?" The high-ranking inspector wiped away his smile and said, "He's dead. He died at a hotel near the Royal Museum." "He's dead?" Klein didn't hide his puzzlement and shock. "I just met him, and he's dead? Had he already been targeted?" The inspector nodded solemnly and said, "Yes, the cause of death is rather complicated, and we aren't ruling out the possibility of murder." "What about his female partner?" Klein frowned as he asked. "He had a female partner when I met him. That lady was his mistress. When she left the hotel, William Sykes was still alive. This can be confirmed by the attendants at the hotel because they had later sent him red wine." The inspector simply shared the situation and said, "After leaving the Royal Museum, where did you go?" "I came back here directly. I had lunch, took a nap, and attended lessons. My servants, neighbors, and literary appreciation teacher can prove that," Klein frankly replied. He then turned his head to Richardson and said, "Bring Walter here." Soon, Walter walked down from the second story with a white glove and answered similar questions. After receiving Dwayne Dantes's permission, the two officers questioned the rest of his servants, but they failed to find any problems. They didn't stay for long, politely bidding him farewell and visiting the other neighbors. Klein's appetite wasn't affected by this matter as he went to the second story to enjoy his dinner. Time quickly flew by as he spent the rest of the time reading books and newspapers. Before sleeping, Klein took in the scenery outside the window as he awaited his valet, Richardson, to take away the fruits in the room. Suddenly, he asked without turning his head, "What did Walter do in the afternoon?" "He was busy handling various matters." "He never left," Richardson answered softly. Klein nodded gently without asking further. He began suspecting if he had been overthinking matters. Phew. He slowly exhaled before getting into bed. In the middle of the night, Klein's spirituality was triggered as he snapped awake. He pricked up his brows, left the bed, and arrived by the window. He pulled back the curtains a little. Under the dim moonlight, a figure carefully passed through the garden's trail and arrived by the perimeter walls before flipping over it. He had a broad forehead with raven black hair and stern brown eyes. He was none other than Butler Walter. He's agile and his motions are fluid. If he's not trained, he's a low-sequence beyonder, Klein observed the scene as he made a preliminary judgment. He saw Walter's shadows follow the streets until he arrived at the manhole which Hazel often used to enter the sewers. He removed the manhole cover, climbed down, and didn't forget to close the cover. Why is everyone so skilled at getting into the sewers? Mr. Butler likely hasn't done it in the past, otherwise, my spirituality would have warned me. After all, he's leaving from my territory. It means that before he became my butler, he had performed such actions quite frequently elsewhere. Klein curled his lips, returned to his bedside, and took out the iron cigar case from under his pillow. He controlled Wraith Senor to tail Walter, wanting to see what he was up to. "I hope it doesn't exceed 100 meters, otherwise, I'll need to enter the sewers as well," as Klein silently muttered to himself. He returned to the gap in the curtains. His marionette, Senor, immediately used the mysterious connection between different mirrors to jump to the street lamp beside the manhole before passing the manhole to silently tail Walter. Klein saw that Walter turned into a more secluded and dark passage after taking 10 meters forward. On the wall were all kinds of moss and dirt. Suddenly, the butler stopped and said to someone, "Why were you so rash? Why didn't you wait for a better opportunity?" Soon, a weak and slightly hoarse female's voice replied to Walter's inquiry. "It was the best opportunity. Once he returns to that manor, there's no knowing when he will come out again." "But why would you be so seriously injured?" Walter said with sighs of concern. The female voice scoffed and said, "William Sykes is stronger than what you or I imagined. Perhaps only this way can he satisfy his secret identity. Regardless, I finally obtained clues from him. After so much time, I finally have a chance to approach the truth. You didn't need to be so rash." Walter fell silent. The weak female's voice chuckled and said, "I've already sold my soul to an evil god. The only meaning to life is vengeance." In a rare instance, Walter sighed and said, "Continue hiding here. I'll prepare food for you until you recover. If there aren't any accidents, use the old method to contact me." The weak female voice remained silent for a while before saying, "When he was alive, he had many subordinates who claimed to be loyal. After his death, few still remember him or are willing to risk their lives for him. You are the one who has surprised me the most. He is the first noble who treated me that way, and he is the person I'm truly loyal to," Walter answered in a deep voice. Having heard the conversation with his marionette, Klein vaguely understood the entire story. After Prince Edisac passed away, a few of his loyal subordinates were investigating the truth of his suicide. Walter was one of them. However, he was mainly in charge of gathering any superficial intelligence, as well as using his identity to provide some help. This is probably the additional development that Rhodes mentioned. Klein immediately made Senor go invisible as he infiltrated the secluded passageway and saw Walter conversing with someone while standing. His figure blocked a black-dressed woman who was seated on the ground against the wall. Her face was somewhat pale. After the woman heard Walter's words, she gave a throaty laugh and looked towards the entrance. "It's time you leave. Don't be caught by others." She turned her head, allowing Klein to see her. She had a round face, slender eyes, and a gentle and refined temperament. Deep down, she was sweet and was an outstandingly gorgeous beauty who Klein was familiar with. Trissy. Trissy Cheek. Chapter 774, Clues She Isn't Dead. She managed to escape. She's actually trying to seek revenge for Prince Edisac. At that moment that he saw Trissy, Klein nearly lost control of his expression. Although he had guessed it based on the conversation, he still felt it exceeded his expectations when the truth was placed before him. Without even the need for a dream divination, he could still recall the great smog of Backlund. Trissy had conversed with him, and back then, she was eager to escape Prince Edisac's control and escape the manipulation of her fate by the hidden person behind the scenes. She felt her daily life was filled with pain. This demoness who was once a man had sold her soul to an evil god to help avenge Prince Edisac. What kind of crappy trite romance plot point is this? The corners of Klein's lips twitched as he saw Walter throw a bag of food to Trissy. After hearing him give a few words of advice, he turned and left the secluded path. At this moment, a figure appeared from Member of Parliament Mock's house. It was within Klein's line of sight from where he was standing. It followed the shadows in the street as it quickly approached the entrance to the sewer. She was none other than Hazel, who held a mystical item from the Marauder pathway. She'll encounter Walter. This isn't some entrance to the sewers. It's clearly the entrance to a bustling city. Klein looked down and nearly facepalmed. Upon arriving at the manhole, Hazel warily observed her surroundings for a few seconds before moving the cover away and climbing down. The entire process was done in one fell swoop without any signs of delay. Stepping onto the slightly moist ground, she followed the rusted metal pipes and the sewage that slowly flowed with a clear destination in mind. Suddenly, she felt her back turn cold as a chill ran down her spine. Her hair began to stand on end. Right on the heels of that, Hazel seemed to plunge into a freezing river, and she felt a coldness that was overcoming her body. She was horrified to see herself walking in a different direction, heading straight for the wall with metal pipes. And this was completely against her will. Horror filled Hazel's mind before she received a reprieve from her numb thoughts. She infused all her spirituality into the necklace on her neck. The 7 green gems on the necklace were equidistant from each other. Embedded around them were tiny diamonds. In the absolute darkness, they still swirled with a faint lustrous glow. Suddenly, a gem lit up as the green glow illuminated Hazel's ghastly face. She leaned against the wall and paused for a moment. She moved her feet forward in an awkward manner before retracting them. At that instant, the coldness Hazel felt had paused for a moment. She didn't hesitate to use her spirituality to light up another green gem. She raised her right hand, aimed it at herself, and twisted her wrist. At the same time, many mysterious symbols and patterns appeared in her mind as her spirituality and voice changed momentarily. She had stolen the Beyonder power, Wraith Shriek. Hazel was just about to open her mouth to shout when she found her hands losing control again. She forcefully and quickly covered her mouth with her hands. Her shriek turned into a muffle as she took a few brisk steps to the wall. She turned into another fork before crouching down in the pure darkness. She tried hard to struggle, but it was useless. She wasn't even capable of activating the necklace on her neck. Hazel's dark brown eyes widened as they filled with horror and indignation. Tears began to well in her eyes before slowly streaming down her cheeks. And at this moment, Walter had come out from another path, returning back to the sewer entrance before climbing up agilely. After he sneaked back into 160 Backlund Street, Hazel suddenly regained control of her body. She felt that the coldness had completely disappeared. She first raised her hands in surprise, using her night vision to take a glance. Following that, she looked around in a fluster, as though there were countless unknown monsters hidden in the darkness of the sewers. Hazel immediately touched the necklace with her right hand, carefully stood up, and headed for the entrance. She didn't flee in panic, but she instead warily prepared for any attack that would appear from the darkness. Finally, she returned to Buklun Street where she saw the black street lamp emitting its light, illuminating the streets that still had the remnant signs of rain. Only then did Hazel speed up her pace and run home. Midway, she suddenly turned back, nervously and frantically closing the manhole's cover. After doing all of this, she followed the shadows and entered her garden. With the help of the gas and water pipes, she entered the balcony to her bedroom. Only at that point did she really have any room to think. She widened her eyes and subconsciously looked around. Slowly, her body began to tremble. She raised her left arm, hoping to use her clothes to wipe her face, but she paused midway, switching to using a handkerchief from her pocket. Hazel still has the basic abilities needed to react. She's not a complete newbie. In the sewers, Senor appeared with his dark red coat and triangular hat as he spoke silently. Following that, under Klein's control, he went invisible again as he entered the hidden fork where Trissy was. Just as the wraith approached, the black-dressed Trissy looked up and revealed a weak but stubborn smile. From the looks of it, you have no ill intentions. That lady was quite lucky. She had sensed Hazel and discovered the wraith. Senor's figure appeared as he chuckled. Perhaps killing her will only bring you greater trouble. To be honest, he wished to report Trissy to the authorities because he knew of the evil deeds she had done. He knew how she had incited the passengers and crew on the Alfalfa, causing them to kill each other out at sea. He also knew how she had many innocent lives die ahead of time. However, after realizing that Trissy was investigating the mystery behind Prince Edisac's death, Klein had a new plan in mind. He would incite the Demoness and cooperate with her on certain matters. The mystery of Prince Edisac's death was equivalent to the truth of the Great Smog of Backlund. Investigating this matter is bound to be very dangerous. Roping others in will make me feel guilty, afraid that harm or even death will happen to them as a result. By getting Trissy to do it, I wouldn't have such a psychological burden. The crime she had committed had long doomed her to hell. The only problem is that she might be using the investigations of the mystery to Prince Edisac's death for her own ploys. I have to be wary about this to prevent myself from being used, thus causing a disaster. As Klein thought, he made Senor take 2 steps forward. Trissy looked at the middle-aged before her and chuckled. Since you have ill intentions, go ahead, Mr. Senor. At this instant, the marionette senses revealed countless threads floating and flailing around Trissy. And seated in the middle was her black-dressed self with a pale face. It resembled a spider in the middle of her web, but it was filled with temptation and pity that made one approach her. You know me? The marionette halted in his footsteps. Trissy's expression was somewhat adrift as she answered in reverie, I once spent an unforgettable period of time at sea. Back then, you were still a man. Klein lampooned and chuckled. Why are you investigating Prince Edisac's death? Didn't he commit suicide? Trissy immediately looked up as anger colored her face. Suicides can be different. Some people do it willingly, others are forced. No way, she really seems to mind Prince Edisac's death. Lady, have you forgotten that you were once a man? Have you forgotten the pain you were previously talking about? Don't tell me that this is the so-called Stockholm Syndrome where you end up bonding with your captor due to the minute amount of kindness they've provided? Well, I'm not a spectator, and I can't determine if she's being truthful or not. Klein made Senor chuckle. So, you believe that Prince Edisac was forced to commit suicide? You sought William Sykes to investigate this matter? The angry look on Trissy's face vanished as a miserable but beautiful smile appeared. That's right. It was he who forced Edisac to commit suicide with a spirituality obliteration bullet. However, he was also under orders by others. To obtain the final bit of pleasure, he revealed everything. He was still unable to really touch me. I even showed him my former photo. He died filled with even more misery and despair. I can't imagine what William suffered. Trissy is as twisted as she was before. Demonesses at the stage of pleasure are really filled with charms. Every expression and every action are filled with enticement. But I can tell that Trissy has already reined it in very well, only using it when needed. She has already advanced? Or is it because of love? As Klein lampooned, he made Senor ask, "Who is it?" When asking that question, Klein hadn't expected to receive an answer, but Trissy chuckled and replied, "Viscount Stratford. The Royal Guard Captain of the Royal Family." Chapter 775, Making Use Viscount Stratford. Royal Guard Captain of the Royal Family. From this post, the Great Smog of Backlund does have inklings of a particular royal family faction being behind it. As for who it is, it will require investigation. Klein temporarily didn't have the time to verify Trissy's answer, so all he did was make Senor scoff. "I'm a little doubtful since you are telling me this so easily." Trissy said in a scoffing and self-deprecating manner, "That's because it's something good for me. I can tell that you and the faction you represent are very interested in the true motives of those pulling the strings of the royal family. I would be very happy if I can provide some useful clues that cause you to have conflict with them, causing the real conspirer to surface. This will aid in my revenge and also be of the greatest help to me." According to this logic, does that also mean that I can use you to investigate this matter and fish out the mastermind behind this? From that, I can allow my faction to hide in safety before it obtains any actual information. Wasn't what Trissy said meant to entice me to engage in limited cooperation with her, while she also volunteers to be the mind-clearer in order to reveal the truth? She is clearly expressing her value. She's afraid that I'll eventually decide to kill her. Klein roughly understood what Trissy was truly getting at as he controlled the wraith to say, "Very reasonable. I should also do the same. I believe that without my threats or enticement, you'll attempt to make contact with Viscount Stratford after you recover from your wounds." Trissy curled her lips and said, "I only hope that he doesn't like men. This isn't something that cannot be resolved. If you're already sequence 5, then you can consider switching to the Hunter Pathways sequence 4 Iron-Blooded Knight. Also, have you forgotten your past self? Why are you getting used to the powers of a demoness of pleasure to deal with men?" Klein lampooned before making Senor smile. "This isn't a problem. You can always show him your old photo." Trissy was taken aback as a slightly twisted expression colored her face. A humiliation that she had buried deep inside her had been dug out, exposing it beneath the sun. Her beautiful eyes were tainted with what stemmed from anger from the humiliation. Her face, which was pale due to her injuries, instantly flushed red. Trissy quickly reined in her emotions and scoffed, speaking with a suppressed voice, as expected of Admiral of Blood. "It appears you know plenty about the demoness pathway." She wasn't sure before. "I made that joke because I thought the demoness sect and the Rose School of Thought had worked together, making her believe that Admiral of Blood would know the secret of the assassin pathway. Regardless, it's not nice mocking the gender of others." This is in line with Admiral of Blood's persona. A marionettist's principle is, remember that every marionette has its own setting? The reason why Trissy had mentioned her past photo was apparently just to vent and grind off an enemy's joy and excitement. She wasn't taking notice of the details she mentioned. Klein nodded in thought as he controlled Senor. "At my level, there will always be plenty of secrets I know." He didn't continue on the topic as he said, "How can I contact you?" I might be able to provide you with some help during the investigations of Viscount Stratford. Trissy reached her hand towards her ear and grabbed a clump of smooth, raven-black hair. Then, blue ice formed, allowing her to crack it off. She then spread out her palm, allowing a silent, pitch-black flame to appear, burning the hair to ashes. These ashes weren't lifted up by the cold winds in the sewers, but they had shrunk, forming a sticky black object. Smear it uniformly over a mirror, and then I'll know that you're looking for me. I'll subsequently use that mirror to communicate with you. Trissy shook her wrist and threw the pasty black object to Senor. It can be used about 5 times, and that should be enough. As Senor was only a marionette, Klein wasn't worried about letting him grab the black sticky object. After taking a few looks, he stuffed it into his pocket. Trissy fell silent for a few seconds before biting her lip. If I need your help, how do I contact you? That's a problem. Klein did wish to have her directly contact Miss Messenger, Rionette Tinker. After all, Trissy would later know that behind the wraith was Gehrman Sparrow if she gathered any news about Admiral of Blood. This wasn't something that could be hidden. After a few seconds of consideration, he decided to be a little more cautious. He decided to wait until Trissy had any substantial discoveries before changing the communication method. After all, she isn't someone to be trusted. To avenge Prince Edisac, some of her feelings are real, but they likely include some other goals, for example, seeking revenge for herself. Klein made Senor survey the area and said, "These sewers hide plenty of secrets. I'll come often. You can leave the help you need in text form here. If the matter is urgent, preventing you from doing it in time, you can contact that person from before to get him to leave the message." Trissy slowly nodded. Okay. With the conversation almost done, Klein planned on letting his marionette, Senor, leave. At that moment, he caught sight of Trissy's hands. He discovered that the sapphire ring, which was equivalent to a grade 0 sealed artifact, was gone. I noticed it just now, but I thought she had switched it to her other hand or another finger, but it's actually gone. From the looks of it, she paid a considerable price back when she escaped Prince Edisac's Red Rose Manor and escaped Ince Zangwil 0-08's control. The mark that the Prince Edisac left on her has also vanished. Klein thought for a moment before getting Senor to laugh. One more thing. Which evil god did you sell your soul to? Trissy gave the middle-aged man a deep look. The primordial demoness, weren't you trying to escape from that strange state? Didn't you feel that you were increasingly becoming less like yourself? Why did you backtrack? Don't you know that by changing your name to Trissy Cheek, they were trying to make you the primordial demoness vessel? No, she might really not know. She might not even know what cheek means. She did her best to escape her fate, only to plunge deeper into it. At that instant, Klein felt a baffling fear towards fate and deities. He made Senor smile. It's hard for me to believe it with you replying so easily without any qualms. Trissy's eyes had a slight tinge of confusion as she said in a self-deprecating manner, "That's because it's a problem for me, not a secret. With one more person knowing, there might be one more chance of a solution presenting itself. Even if the chances are slim, it's better than nothing. While solving the problem, there's also a high chance that you'll be finished." Klein didn't continue the topic as he said after some thought, "When you approach Viscount Stratford and the mastermind behind all of this, take note of any coincidences that often happen around you. The deeper the investigation into the great smog of Backlund is, the more likely it would gain the attention of Ince Zangwil and 0-08. Coincidences, Trissy was taken aback as she repeated the word. At that instant, she recalled all the coincidences she had encountered back at Red Rose Manor. Amidst her thoughts, she suddenly looked up, only to realize that Admiral of Blood Senor had vanished. The next morning, Klein woke up punctually, and with the assistance of Richardson, he wore his coat. Just as he arrived in the dining hall, he saw Walter standing by the door, politely awaiting his arrival. Sir, your schedule for today is to participate in a tea session at Member of Parliament Mock's residence. Walter professionally reminded his employer. He was stern, old-fashioned, and conscientious. He looked no different from his usual self, making it impossible to tell that he had headed for the sewers in the middle of the night. Klein nodded with a smile as though nothing had happened. I haven't forgotten. He then entered the dining hall and enjoyed an exquisite meal that had started showing signs of being repetitive. There's not enough variety for breakfast. Klein focused on eating, and after he was done, he put down his cutlery and sighed. I miss my hometown a little. Get the cook to prepare some desi pie tomorrow. Yes, sir. I should have thought of that earlier, housekeeper Taneja replied apologetically. Klein waved his hand as a gesture for her not to take it to heart before he headed to the garden for a stroll. After doing all of this, he returned to the third story to continue reading the papers he hadn't finished until his etiquette teacher, Wiana, arrived. Wiana was still dressed decently with an elegant bearing. She smiled at Dwayne Dantes and said, I heard you would be heading to Ma'am Rihanna's place for high tea later today. Then, this lesson will focus on high tea. Klein maintained his smile as he listened attentively, asking questions from time to time. About 30 minutes later, Walter knocked on the door and entered. Sir, Member of Parliament Mock's servant just came over to inform us that the high tea session has been cancelled because Ma'am Rihanna's daughter, Miss Hazel, is sick. She's very apologetic for that, and she wishes to invite you again next week. Hazel is sick. A result of last night's fright? It's not impossible if it's an ordinary person, but a beyonder has their physical qualities enhanced. The chances of that happening are very low. Furthermore, Hazel clearly hasn't seen the changes that result from the loss of control brought about by potions. Her mental state is still well, allowing her to feel a sense of superiority and having no fear. Even if she was frightened, it wouldn't result in any psychological ailments. Sequence 5 of the Demoness pathway can make people around them get infected with ailments. Last night, Trissy secretly released her ailment after seeing a stranger enter the sewers. And as a wraith, Senor wasn't affected, so I didn't discover it. Such a problem isn't too serious. Hazel didn't spend much time in the area for too long. She's just a little shaken, preventing her from recovering quickly. From the looks of it, Trissy has really advanced to sequence 5. Klein nodded gently and said, Please give Miss Hazel my regards. Chapter 776, Preparations. Without the high tea session, Klein decided to pray at St. Samuel Cathedral, so as to show his devoutness. Of course, he didn't forget to stop and admire the white pigeons on the square, allowing himself to appear leisurely and calm. He entered the cathedral, passing through the murals that were illuminated by the sun from high above and arriving at a dark and deep prayer hall. This place wasn't as gorgeously decorated like the other churches that had all kinds of dazzling elegant taste that produced a visual impact. Instead, it was mild and peaceful, allowing one to feel a natural sense of tranquility. As for the pure light that resembled twinkling stars up ahead, they were filled with the intense solemnity of holiness. Klein removed his hat and handed it to Richardson along with his cane. Then, he walked down the aisle. At this moment, two figures stood up in the front pew and turned towards the entrance. One of them was the black-haired, green-eyed Leonard Mitchell who looked suave with his untidy hair. Almost at the same moment, Leonard Mitchell also saw the middle-aged man with the white sideburns and deep blue eyes. Dwayne Dantes. He tensed up momentarily as his body showed signs of indiscernible stiffness. Klein gave Leonard a side look as he nodded with a smile. He had a friendly and casual expression. Leonard forced a smile as he nodded in a slightly sluggish manner. Following that, he turned to the side, made way, and brushed shoulders with Dwayne Dantes. This made Klein see who the person was behind him. It was also someone he knew, Daly, who was wearing a spirit medium's black robe. This lady still wore blue eyeshadow and blush, presenting quite an uncanny sense of beauty. Daly glanced at the middle-aged gentleman when her expression suddenly went adrift. She retracted her gaze as she silently approached the exit. "No way, I was just mimicking Captain's profound eyes. Even the color is different, yet Ma'am Daly could still find it familiar? A woman's intuition is truly terrifying." Klein had a vague guess when he noticed Daly's brief abnormality. A long time ago, as an insensitive man, he believed that Ma'am Daly was secretly in love with Captain, otherwise, she wouldn't have endured the risk to rush to Tingen to get Klein to find an opportunity to teach the acting method to Dunn Smith. As for Captain, Klein wasn't sure about his thoughts. After all, Dunn Smith, at that moment, was often unable to distinguish reality from a dream. His bad memory was rather pronounced, and he might unknowingly have forgotten certain things that lay at the bottom of his heart. However, Captain often mentions Ma'am Daly, using her as an example to educate us. He was so familiar with how many years she took to advance and the kind of talent she had that it seemed like he had memorized it. Yes, whenever Captain mentioned these matters, he would occasionally add that he spent 9 years going from midnight poet to nightmare. See, could it be that he was feeling a little inferior when facing Ma'am Daly? Inferior. Klein recalled the past as his mood suddenly felt dampened. He realized that he didn't really understand Dunn Smith. He didn't understand how many things the man had hidden inwardly. And Ma'am Daly isn't much younger than him. She appears to be very open and doesn't care about marriage. Klein silently sighed and reined in his thoughts. He found a nearby pew and bowed his head, closing his eyes to pray. Outside the prayer hall, Leonard had recovered as he gathered with the other Red Gloves teammates with Daly. They waited for a while as Soest, who had become a spirit warlock, walked out from another side. He scanned them and said, "Our mission this time is to use the various clues discovered from the explosion of the Black Skeleton Gang's headquarters to find all the formal members of the Numinous Episcopate in Backlund. Ma'am Daly is a Beyonder from the Corpse Collector pathway. She knows quite a bit about the Numinous Episcopate, so His Grace, Saint Anthony, has gotten her to assist us." In the evening, Klein, who had dismissed Richardson, took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the grey fog. He conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow and made his blurry figure pray. "Please inform Miss Magician that she needs to reserve a hotel room before Friday night. It's best that it's far from the place where Mr. X holds the gathering. Pass me the stone and spell book ahead of time. I need to make certain preparations. On Friday night, she needs to stop her friend who participates in Mr. X's gathering and also present to me that person's external appearance when in disguise. If there's anything else, I'll inform her in time." With only 2 days left before the assassination attempt on Mr. X, Klein undoubtedly needed to prepare ahead of time. And there were many things that needed preparation. Dwayne Dantes wasn't able to do everything, so he had to rely on Miss Magician. His preliminary plan was to use the powers of a faceless to disguise himself as a participant in Mr. X's gathering. He would enter directly with the passcode, and then he would employ different plans based on the situation. According to the experience he had in engaging in combat and controlling his marionette, Klein had a feeling that a marionettist's principle was, try to hide behind the scenes, covertly directing a script. Unless necessary, a marionettist had to avoid engaging in direct combat with others. Currently, the most troublesome point is that Mr. X's gathering is at 8. And usually, at this time, Dwayne Dantes clearly wouldn't have fallen asleep. He won't be able to escape the notice of his butler and servants and secretly head to East Borough. Of course, on the contrary, it can also create an alibi, but the problem is, what method should I use to fool everyone in his house? If only I had a faceless partner who can act as Dwayne Dantes. Miss Justice's necklace can do it, but she's not in Backlund. Klein leaned back into his chair as he rubbed his temples. He had even considered directly summoning and responding to himself, using his identity as Hero Bandit Black Emperor to carry out the operation, but doing so would cause him to lose the ability to change his physical appearance. It also made it difficult for him to possess others and disguise as Furza's friend to participate in the gathering. Unless Miss Magician's friend is a part of this, allowing me to possess him or her. That wouldn't do either. First, it will expose some of the Tarot Club's secrets, and second, Mr. X might have the means to discover a wraith. Of course, traces of this can be concealed using a series of seals with a gold coin, the paper angel, or the iron cigar case. Klein considered for a while before deciding on a method he was very proficient in from his previous life. Feigning sickness. I'll begin acting sick tomorrow. I'll eat very little, and sleep before 8. This way, the butler and servants wouldn't disturb me. But if there's an emergency, what do I do when Walter and company knock on the door? A magician's illusion creation can only fool the eyes. It isn't some artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence. Right, I can fix the illusion onto a mirror, letting it look like Dwayne Dante's. Then, I'll get a Rhodes to answer remotely. With this in mind, Klein's thoughts suddenly opened up. I have to say that a Rhodes can be quite useful at times. After a poignant comment, Klein returned to the real world. He walked to the desk, took out pen and paper, and began drawing a picture comprising of symbols that implied secrecy and mystery prying. Just as he finished his final stroke, the room's lighting dimmed suddenly. The full-body mirror first turned deep black before silver light surfaced. Loanese text appeared one after another. Great Master, your loyal and humble servant, a Rhodes, heard your summoning. Was I late? There's something new every time. Klein shook his head in amusement. No. How tolerant you are of me, Great Master. You can ask your question. Words neatly appeared on the mirror. Klein thought for a moment before saying, I plan on eliminating the Aurora Order Oracle, Mr. X. Do you have any suggestions? The full-body mirror's words froze for a few seconds before changing. It's best you do it after Thursday. It's in line with my divination. Angel of Fate Ouroboros or a saint of the Aurora Order might be around Mr. X tonight and on Thursday. Klein smiled and said, A Rhodes, I have something that requires your help. This is my honor. You are giving me an opportunity. Words quickly emerged, fully professing what it meant to be excited and delighted. May I ask what the mission is? Klein nodded and said, This Friday night, I will be using a mirror as an illusion prop, changing it to look like my present identity. If any emergencies happen, you're in charge of controlling the mirror to answer without letting anyone discover any abnormalities. Can you do it? The air around the full-body mirror suddenly gushed around, and a toady voice belonging to Dwayne Dante sounded, Great Master, I'll try my best to complete anything you command. Although it won't be able to last long, and it doesn't match my usual habits, it's enough to deal with everyone here. If you wish, I can simulate any voice. You're more talented than I expected. It's not easy being a mirror these days. However, why does that final statement sound odd? Klein's facial muscles trembled as he said, when dealing with them, hide the nature of the question and answer game. Don't let others notice it. A Rhodes immediately presented a new sentence on the full-body mirror, I will play your identity well. Very good. Klein nodded. He was truly worried that a Rhodes would begin asking butler Walter and valet Richardson embarrassing questions. Questions like, have you fantasized about ladies you shouldn't have any urges for, or, who do you think of late at night when resolving your physical needs? He believed that with the magic mirror's way of doing things, it might very well carry out such an act without any forewarning. Back then, Danitz nearly broke down thanks to its questions. Without speaking any further, Klein switched to saying, that will be all for today. I'll contact you again on Friday night. Yes, Great Master. Your humble servant already looks forward to serving you. A Rhodes first conjured a single line before producing a drawing of a hand waving. Chapter 777, Sick and Crazy Setup. On Friday afternoon, Klein, who had skipped a literary salon because of his feigned sickness, arrived above the grey fog once again. In front of him was a hard-covered, palm-sized notebook which was bronze-green in color. It was Layman's Travels which the magician Furs had provided. After flipping the item which was closer to a spellbook over to a certain page, Klein looked at the yellowish-brown page, raised his hand, and summoned the sea god scepter from the junk pile. As he injected some of his spirituality into Layman's Travels, making it light up with a faint luster, he made the blue gem on the scepter's tip emit a bright light. A sizzling sound was produced as bolts of silver lightning appeared out of thin air. They were thick and menacing as they zapped about, meshing together to form a hurricane. At the same time, complicated symbols and labels quickly outlined themselves on the page of Layman's Travels. They overlapped each other and fused together, slowly taking shape. Just as the page was about to be colored in silver, bolts of lightning snaked out from it, causing all the patterns to be destroyed. It failed again. Klein sighed silently as he repeated the same process. This wasn't his first attempt. Ever since he obtained Layman's Travels on Wednesday night, he would head above the grey fog from time to time, using this spellbook to record the powers produced by the sea god scepter. He repeated it until his spirituality was nearly drained, forcing him to return to the real world to take a break. During this process, there were successes and failures. Klein relied on repeated attempts before completing the final step, recording the lightning storm spell which he had eyed for a very long time. This was a demigod power of the sailor pathway. Before that failure, Klein had failed nearly 20 times. It could be said that his luck was terrible. After repeated failures, he was delighted to see a silver luster spread across the yellowish page at the 5th attempt. An ancient, mysterious, complicated, and indescribable symbol contracted, forming a fancy diagram that made anyone who placed their eyes on it feel as though they were being struck by lightning. Phew! I've finally succeeded. Klein rubbed his fingers against the paper and heaved a long sigh of relief. He flipped through Layman's Travels and admired his previous efforts. Over the past 2 days, he wasn't fully caught up with Lightning Storm. He also recorded 2 other demigod powers. One of them was Paper Angel that he had used while stirring some of the powers above the grey fog. It aided in disrupting any divination and prophecies. Similarly, there was Hurricane that stemmed from the sea god scepter. When recording them, Klein was rather lucky. One took 9 times, while the other took 12 before he succeeded. As for Flight, Glide, Lightning Strike, and other powers that didn't reach sequence 4, they only required him to do it once or twice. Therefore, Klein had almost filled the entire book. This spellbook isn't very useful to unaffiliated Beyonders. It needs plenty of time and patience to record a sufficient number of powers. And when the powers exceed sequence 6, the chances of failure increases, making the powers difficult to obtain. However, there are 22 pathways in the mystical domain. If the first few sequences have their powers matched well, finishing off a sequence 5 isn't too surprising. Klein closed Layman's Travels and sighed inwardly. From his point of view, the spellbook was equivalent to half a divine artifact for unaffiliated Beyonders. Although it was more difficult to be useful than Creeping Hunger in its early stages, once there was a good combination, it was quite normal for one to fight someone of a higher sequence. However, among Beyonders who were supported by major factions, Layman's Travels would be ridiculously powerful. This was because it could record a demigod's powers. As long as they wish, a demigod can repeat the power again and again. As for Creeping Hunger, it has a high chance of failing to devour a demigod. Even a real shepherd would find it extremely difficult to graze a high-sequence Beyonder. Firstly, there are no available resources, and secondly, it's easy to lose control. Elder Lovia from the City of Silver was someone lucky enough to be able to graze a sequence 4 evil spirit. When Klein thought of this, he cast his gaze onto a dark green, coarse stone. It was rough and uneven with signs of burn marks. It was none other than Furz's stone that allowed the traversal of the spirit world. With Lamino's travels and this stone, along with the Luck Siphon charm and Wraith marionette, even if Mr. X has a saint protecting him, I should still be able to complete the mission and leave without problems. Klein rubbed his temples and returned to the real world. After setting up a bestowment ritual, he brought the corresponding items back. After making all the preparations, he walked to the full-body mirror and looked at himself. He made himself look haggard. After dinner, Klein had used the excuse of not being well to return to his room. After taking in the night scenery, he took out a palm-sized mirror from the drawer and placed it on the soft and elastic pillow. Then, Klein went over, making the mirror reflect the blue-eyed, white-sideburned Dwayne Dantes. He then slowly straightened his body and took a step back, creating another Dwayne Dantes in bed. This gentleman was wearing silk pajamas and leaning against a pillow. He held a book in hand with his eyes half closed as though he was in thought. Not bad, the mirror illusion isn't weaker than a paper figurine illusion. Klein returned to the desk and picked up a fountain pen, drawing the strange symbol that was a mixture of secrecy and mystery prying. After a brief silence, the Dwayne Dantes in bed suddenly opened his eyes and gave a toady smile. "Great Master, your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, is here." I have to say that even with Dwayne Dantes's face, there's no way he can look normal with that kind of smile. Klein silently sighed and nearly turned to look to his side. "Very good," he praised with a nod. He didn't give any other instructions. With a half-top hat, he slid down from the balcony to the first floor. He followed the secluded garden trail and flipped over the corner perimeter wall of 160 Buckland Street. During this process, he hadn't forgotten to close the windows. Pressing his right hand on his hat and landing his feet on the streets, Klein slowly looked up. At some point in time, his facial features and outline had changed. He had black hair and brown eyes, with a thin and angular face. This was the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, who had a bounty of £50,000 from just a single country. The hunt was about to begin. Sherwood Beyonder. Zio, who was just about to head out to East Borough to participate in Mr. X's Beyonder gathering, was stopped by Furze. "You want to head out to gather material?" Zio deliberated before saying the words her friend often used. Furze stroked her hair and said, "No, to earn money. I previously accepted a mission to find the dust left behind after a ghost fades away. As you know, there aren't any ghosts at the cemetery. They've all been given a send-off by the priests and bishops to their respective deities' kingdom. Therefore, I can only head over to East Borough and find targets that died due to various reasons without being discovered. Can you bear letting such a beautiful and frail lady like me head into such a messy place alone? But, can't you push it back a day?" Zio said hesitantly. "I'm planning to participate in Mr. X's gathering." Furze immediately shook her head. "No, I need to complete the mission tomorrow. It's a total of £50. If it's due tomorrow, why didn't you do it the past few days?" Zio looked suspiciously at her friend. Furze chuckled. "Is this your first day knowing me? Don't you know I have a severe case of procrastination? Besides, you have no money. What's the point of going to Mr. X's gathering? You don't even know what Beyonder ingredients you need." "That's true." Zio was convinced before she smiled. "Does every author have a sickness of procrastination?" "Probably." As Furze perfunctorily replied, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. In the East Borough, inside a cheap motel, Klein entered the room which Miss Magician had reserved for him under a fake alias. Here, having a room and a bed for one person was an extravagance, but even so, such rooms only cost 12 pence a night. Of course, many of the cheap motels in East Borough didn't have any single rooms. The best of them were some compartments that cost 5 pence a night. It only had a bed and a partition that blocked others from looking inside, allowing the occupants to change clothes. As for the 10 to 20 bunk beds in the basement, they cost 1.5 pence a night. The motel didn't hold any responsibilities for the items that one stored there. There's actually a mirror. Not bad. Klein put down his hat and stood in front of a full-body mirror filled with crevices. He then wore the hooded robe which Miss Magician had prepared for him. Immediately after that, his body shrank at a discernible pace. His skin gradually turned pale with a tinge of malt colors. The Adam's apple at his throat vanished as his hair grew long and turned blonde. Klein instantly recognized the image of Furza's friend, even though the disguise didn't show her looks. It was Miss Zio. However, because there was a hood to conceal himself, he didn't really transform into a woman. All he did was handle the easily noticeable spots. I can't do anything about the height of 150 centimeters. I'll need to digest the entirety of my potion before I can reach this limit. Thankfully, Miss Zio disguises herself by raising her height. I don't have to vex over this. Klein looked at the 160 centimeter tall figure in the mirror, switched to a pair of leather boots that looked to be and was flat-soled. After donning the disguise, Klein hooded himself and silently left the single room from the window. He came to an alley in East Borough, taking a detour until he arrived outside the building where Mr. X was hosting the Beyonder gathering. After recalling the passcode which Miss Magician had provided, Klein rapped the door with his fingers, 3 light taps and 3 heavy taps, separated by 2 long and 3 short intervals. After 10 seconds, the door silently opened. An attendant wearing an iron mask first observed the visitor before making way. Klein calmly walked past him and entered the building without showing any signs of panic. Chapter 778, 1 + 1 > 2. While passing through the living room, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered. He felt that there was an invisible gaze scanning him from an unknown location. He feigned ignorance as he entered the activity room ahead. He surveyed the area and found a spot that wasn't too far or close to the host's seat. And at the moment he passed through the activity room's door, all the attention on him vanished. If not for the wraith having 3 seals to isolate it, it probably would have been noticed. Mr. X doesn't appear to be as bold and crazy as he seems. Klein sat down and moved his hood, hiding his face deeper in the shadows. After about 10 minutes, when most of the members had arrived, a brass mask-wearing Mr. X appeared by the door without causing a commotion. He walked in and headed towards his seat. He was dressed in a black classical robe with a pointed mage hat. As he walked, he had a converged aura, but it was enough to make everyone present bow their heads without realizing it. Turning around and slowly taking his seat, Mr. X surveyed the room and said in a deep voice, "Let's begin." He's within 4 meters. Klein wasn't in a rush to take action. He retracted his gaze and patiently watched as a few gathering members exchanged information about people with abnormal luck for money. Occasionally, Mr. X would reply. Time ticked by as the gathering's focus went from Mr. X's act of handing out rewards to the transactions between the members. Klein didn't hesitate as he tapped his left thumb on the first segment of his index finger twice, activating his spirit body thread's vision. Illusory black threads immediately surfaced before his eyes as they emanated from the bodies of different people, out into the void towards some boundless distance. After making a simple distinction of the threads, Klein began to secretly control Mr. X's spirit body threads. There were 2 difficulties to this mission according to his plan. The first was that having astrologer as one of the earlier jobs in his pathway, Mr. X, or the other hidden Aurora Order saint might be able to sense the danger when he began controlling the spirit body threads, acutely sensing some abnormality. Klein wasn't sure about Mr. X's spiritual intuition because back when Miss Sharon existed in a wraith state, she failed to notice marionettist Rosego's controlling of her spirit body threads. However, for a saint who was a demigod, a high-sequence beyonder who had obtained godhood, no special trait of this being would surprise Klein. It wasn't surprising if that being's spiritual intuition was triggered due to the changes in another person's spirit-body threads. For other marionettists, they were probably helpless regarding this. But Klein was different. He had another identity as the Fool. He had the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog to aid him, allowing him to rely on paper angels to produce interference and eliminate any hidden problems. The gathering continued without any abnormalities. More than 10 seconds passed as Klein was close to gaining initial control of Mr. X. There was only 3 seconds left, but this Aurora Order Oracle didn't notice at all. He continued observing the completion of another transaction with a deep look in his eyes, his thoughts a mystery. At the critical moment, Klein stopped. He barely maintained his progress as he extended his hand, reaching into the pocket of the hooded robe and touching the iron cigar case which had been sealed with a wall of spirituality. Klein moved his fingers, prodding it gently to remove the wall of spirituality, allowing it to disperse into a swirling wind inside his pocket. He pulled back his palm and waited for a few more seconds until Mr. X's gaze looked to the side before he continued controlling the spirit-body threads. 2 seconds. 1 second. 0. Mr. X's thoughts turned sluggish as though someone had poured stirred cement onto him. An enemy. Danger. Slow thoughts appeared in his head as he quickly made his decision. He planned on seeking help from his subordinates and the entity who was watching in secret, and put up an effective resistance. At this moment, coldness drilled into his body, preventing his limbs and mouth from answering his will. Admiral of Blood Seigneur. A wraith's possession. There were many flaws to a marionettist's control of spirit-body threads. The biggest problem was the target immediately realizing that there was a problem once initial control was attained. They would then have the ability to carry out any contingencies. If it was one-on-one, without anyone around them, Klein could naturally use the target's increasingly impeded state to effectively disrupt and interfere with any resistance they put up, but if the target had any aids, it was very difficult for a marionettist's control to fool others. It required help from the environment, or partners to conceal the matter without exposing it. And on this point, a wraith who was able to possess a target and forcefully control them was the best support for a marionettist. The reason why Klein didn't directly enter a state of initial control was because he needed to release the wraith. After the initial inspection at the door, the vigilance in the activity room at the gathering location was definitely lower. Mr. X's eyes widened as his thoughts turned sluggish. His instinctive attempt to shout was blocked by his throat and mouth, silencing him completely. His attempt to raise his hands also slowed down as they reached for a porcelain teacup by his side. This completely violated his will. It was because of the cold aura that occupied every corner of his body. Wraith. Marionettist. No. If this continues, I'll die silently. Mr. X immediately controlled his spirituality as he constructed complicated symbols and labels in his mind. He was just about to open a traveler's door, which was also the door of teleportation, to escape the marionettist's control range. Compared to that, a wraith's possession was relatively less dangerous. But amidst his sluggish thoughts, the illusory symbols and labels failed to appear all at once. Instead, they appeared one stroke after another in a discontinuous manner and at an insufficient speed. Seizing this opportunity, Wraith Seigneur, who was possessing Mr. X, under marionettist Klein's control, simply moved Mr. X's head, changing his seating position. Such an action instantly interrupted the formation of the traveler's door. Oh no! My reaction is too slow. It will be interfered by the wraith. Use mystical item. Mr. X's eyes filled with blood, but none of his subordinates around him noticed it. Even the one watching in secret didn't notice any abnormalities. As for the gathering members who were interacting and trading, they lowered their voices because of his change in seating posture. At that moment, the activity room was filled with people. Although there were beyonders everywhere and many were his assistants, Mr. X found himself in extreme solitude and was helpless. He didn't even know who was attacking him or where the attacker was sitting. As the thoughts went through his mind, Mr. X regained control of his spirituality as he directed it towards the golden ring with an embedded ruby on his left index finger. However, going from a thought to a decision, and then going from a decision to an action took too long. It was as though he was acting out his thought processes in slow motion. This gave Senor plenty of time to raise Mr. X's left palm, bend his finger, and tap the side of his forehead which was uncovered by the brass mask as though in thought. It was a very faint tapping sound, and the strength used was quite significant, but under Klein's control, Senor held back perfectly. It made most of the strength enter Mr. X's mind without spreading outwards so as to hide any commotion. Tack! Tack! Mr. X's thoughts of emanating his spirituality were disrupted, and he was temporarily unable to find his train of thought. By the time he recovered, the marionettist's control had deepened. This made his thoughts chaotic and impeded. Even his thinking and decision-making became extremely difficult. With the wraith using all kinds of tiny, concealed actions to interfere with Mr. X's attempts to use his various beyonder powers and impressive mystical items, he slowly slid towards the abyss of becoming a marionette. He watched helplessly as he marched towards death slowly. Only then did he realize how terrifying and unsolvable the combination of a marionettist and wraith was. The hunt continued silently under everyone's noses. As Klein's control deepened, Mr. X's actions turned stiffer and sluggish. However, with the wraith possessing him, no one could notice any problems. To be precise, Mr. X's actions were no longer a result of the sluggish him, but from Wraith Senor. He wasn't even able to show the look of despair in his eyes. Amidst the transactions that either succeeded or failed, ranging from arguments to negotiations, 5 minutes quickly passed. Klein was just one last step from killing Mr. X and turning him into his marionette. However, he couldn't do so. This was because he had yet to digest much of the marionettist potion. He could only control one marionette at present, so if he wanted to convert Mr. X, he had to give up Wraith Senor. But once he gave up Senor, this Admiral of Blood who was long dead would immediately surface and be discovered by everyone. It would bring about extreme trouble. Similarly, if Klein didn't give up his Wraith marionette and assassinated Mr. X while he wasn't able to resist, he needed to consider the Aurora Order Saint who was lurking in the shadows. This was the second most difficult part of his plan. To silently control Mr. X and remove his ability to resist wasn't difficult with the combination of marionettist and wraith. The way to kill him wasn't difficult as well. Mr. X in his present state could easily be finished off by Klein with an air bullet. The difficulty was in leaving safely after pulling off such a stunt. This actually required sufficient patience. Time slowly passed with Klein appearing calm despite his tensed nerves. He pretended that he wasn't interested in the items that appeared as he kept silent the entire time. Finally, when the gathering came to an end, Mr. X said in a deep voice with complete normality, "The end." His words were succinct, just like the way he ended the previous gathering. This was what Zio described to Furs. As the gathering's members stood up one by one, Klein mixed in among them, looking inconspicuous. At the same time, he reached his hand into his pocket, and he flipped open Lamino's travels based on his sense of touch. Chapter 779, One-Shot. The 3 types of paper in Lamino's travels clearly had different textures. The white paper that could only record sequence 7, 8, and 9 powers was thin, smooth and flat. The yellowish-brown goatskin which could record sequence 5 and 6 powers were very pliable like tanned leather. The 3 charred yellow pages that could record godhood powers were thick and textured. Together, they allowed someone to quickly distinguish between them simply from touch. Klein's fingers quickly found the thick and textured 3 pages as he gently pinched the middle page. Although his pocket wasn't large enough, preventing him from fully opening Lamino's travels. The hooded robe was personally modified by Furs herself. The pocket had plenty of space, allowing the palm-sized spellbook to be flipped to a right angle. As Klein used his palm to prevent Lamino's travels from closing, he used his finger to slide across the corresponding page's surface. The surface had slight bumps and depressions, making the strange patterns and symbols that were filled with mystery and ancient vibes be directly presented in his mind. He injected his spirituality into it. This charred yellow page recorded a demigod power of the storm pathway, hurricane. Klein wanted to use it to create chaos, so as to interfere with the Aurora Order Saint who was lurking in the darkness. By doing so, he could seize the opportunity to assassinate Mr. X and escape with the help of the wind. Aside from this goal, the chaos could also effectively hide his tracks. By letting the members of the gathering scatter, and with everyone's identity being a mystery, doing so made everyone be a suspect. The Aurora Order would then find it difficult to pinpoint Zio. As his thoughts whirred, Klein locked his gaze onto a spot, and he slowly pulled out Lamino's travels. Meanwhile, Mr. X took 2 steps to Klein's side, standing near him like he was a friend he hadn't seen in years. Following that, there was a loud buzz as a terrifying hurricane spiraled out of control in front of everybody. It was where Klein had targeted his spirituality at. The tables, coffee tables, sofa, and high-back chairs in the room flew up as the violent hurricane ripped through the walls, carrying the roof away as it headed for the alley. Some of the gathering's participants were in the way of the hurricane and were thrown far away, while others fell forward due to the wind pressure as they ran in another direction. If Klein hadn't purposely controlled the timing and direction of the hurricane, not only would Mr. X's old house be destroyed, but even the series of condominiums around it would suffer damage. As for the gathering participants, they would have been swept up in the hurricane, having their survival depend solely on luck. The buzzing sounds quickly intensified as the hurricane that reached into the sky was like a terrifying giant. It stomped across the alley towards the street, leaving nothing behind in its wake. Klein was similarly swept up as he and the possessed Mr. X were thrown onto another street. During this process, as both of them were standing close to one another, along with how a wraith could float, these could control the target's body to a certain extent even with the hurricane. Therefore, the distance between Klein and Mr. X ultimately stayed within 5 meters. His control of the spirit body threads had never been terminated. In midair, with the howling winds in his ear, Klein suddenly yanked at his chest with his right hand, tearing away the hooded robe's surface, reached under his arm, and drew death knell. Although in Mr. X's current state where just air bullets alone could finish him off, Klein decided to be cautious. He was afraid that certain mystical items on his body would suddenly be triggered, just like Admiral of Blood Seigneur's necklace. When hunting, it was necessary to do his best. Klein's vigorous action of drawing his revolver had obviously affected his control of the spirit body threads. If it wasn't because Mr. X was on the brink of being fully controlled, just this alone was enough to recover his usual lucidness. However, even so, Mr. X's thoughts were no longer impeded as his mind sped up. He attempted to resist, but with Wraith Seigneurs possessing him, it had forced his efforts to be in vain for a brief moment. Then, Mr. X's eyes reflected an enemy who swooped downward. It was a thin face with pronounced facial lines. In his vision, the person coldly cocked the revolver, pointing the black barrel at him. Bang! Klein didn't hesitate to pull the trigger as the gunshot was drowned by the howling winds. Mr. X's head jerked backwards as though an invisible hand had pressed onto it. His head and brass mask shattered into pieces, splattering red and white liquids everywhere. It was a lethal shot. Death knell had sounded the knell for him. Plop! After the shot, Klein fell to the ground on his back. With a thud, Mr. X landed beside him as the blood and fragments that scattered in midair had strangely flowed back, gathering by his neck and forming a head filled with cracks and crevices. This was the ability of a wraith. At that moment, the hurricane was starting to disperse, and the huge commotion had undoubtedly caught the notice of faraway demigods. Inside the Holy Wind Cathedral, the new Backlund Archbishop, deep blue officiant Randall Valentinus, instantly flew out of his room as he floated in the air. Klein, who had fallen on the ground, noticed that the wind pressure had weakened. With Death Knell in one hand and Laymanos Travels in the other, he flipped the latter to the first yellowish-brown goatskin page. After obtaining this spellbook, he realized that there were a few pages recorded in it, with one of them being Traveler's Door. Klein originally imagined that it was a coincidence, but on careful thought, he found it inevitable. This was because Laymanos Travels belonged to the ancient Abraham family. They wielded the apprentice pathway and several corresponding mystical items, so they had the resources to easily record a traveler's powers. After all, this was something very, very useful. At that moment, as long as the Traveler's Door was formed, Klein could leave unharmed with Mr. X's corpse that was being possessed by Wraith Seigneur. He hadn't used it in the building, because it was possible that the Aurora Order Saint might intercept it. Furthermore, Mr. X was also a traveler. He had a chance of successfully escaping via Traveler's Door. Therefore, Klein didn't dare risk it before he was completely dead. At that moment, Klein's vision went black as he realized that the surrounding streets were filled with a pitch-black and strange liquid. They surged over and quickly coagulated to form a strong cage. In such darkness, shadows began to come alive as cold gazes landed on him. A demigod's power. The Aurora Order does have a saint nearby. There's no way to directly teleport away. Klein's heart tensed up as he calmly flipped Laymanos Travels to the charred yellow page. Sizzle. A silver python snaked out of thin air, embroiling itself with the darkness as it illuminated everything. Lightning storm. The coagulated pitch-blackness shattered instantly. And without any hesitation, Klein stuffed his death knell-wielding right hand into his pocket, pinching the dark green stone that was filled with burn marks. Door. He chanted in ancient Hermes with an abnormally calm tone. A light blue brilliance burst out as Klein's figure rapidly turned into a blur. Even Mr. X's corpse, which had come close to grab onto his shoulder, had experienced similar changes. The two figures instantly turned invisible as they vanished from the spot. They quickly departed into the spirit world with overlapping saturated colors, pulling off an ingenious escape. In the shadowy alley with the flattened gathering building, which had planks, rubble, clothes, and all kinds of random items strewn all around, someone harumphed. Damn it! At this moment, the other gathering members had already fled the street. From far away in the sky, a sonic boom could be heard. Zio and Furs, who were searching for ghosts in East Borough, were alarmed by the sky that suddenly lit up. They hurriedly looked into the distance and saw the silver forest that seemed to bloom like a forest. The twisted form and sense of horror had left them trembling despite the distance. They didn't even dare look straight at it. What happened over there? Zio mumbled as she exchanged looks with Furs blankly. Furs actually had a guess, but she found it difficult to believe. This was because it had far exceeded her expectations of the world Gehrman Sparrow's strength. In a dark alley, Klein appeared out of thin air with Mr. X's corpse as they landed on the ground. He wasn't flustered at all. He kept Death Knell in his pocket and then took out another book. Grozel's Travels. Smack. Klein smacked the book written by Dragon of Imagination Enkwelt onto Mr. X's face, staining the cover with blood. Moments later, Mr. X's corpse vanished, leaving behind Wraith Seigneur in his dark red coat and old triangular hat. Right on the heels of that, Klein put away Grozel's Travels, flipped open Laymanos Travels and made another charred yellow page face up. Suddenly, a bright light emitted from the book as an illusory angel with 12 wings flew up and landed on Klein. All of this happened in an instant before darkness returned to the alley. Only the dim moonlight continued illuminating the area silently. Klein immediately took out another metal bottle, poured out the blood stored inside, and uniformly smeared it across Laymanos Travels. After doing all of this, he put away everything else, pulling away the hooded robe and throwing it beside him. A scarlet flame immediately soared up, burning the tattered robe clean. Meanwhile, Klein silently grew another 10 centimeters as he transformed into a relatively ordinary appearance. Then, he identified his bearings with the help of the stars, and he picked up a fallen branch to assist him as he quickly toured through the dark and deteriorated streets, returning back to the cheap motel. At this point, he still had no idea what additional weakness he had been given. Inside the single room in the motel, Klein changed into his own clothes, turning back into Gehrman Sparrow. Seeing this thin and cold-looking crazy adventurer in the mirror, he fell silent for a few seconds, picking up the half-top hat and wearing it. Above the flattened building, Church of Storms Cardinal, Backlund Diocese Archbishop, Deep Blue Officiant Randall Valentinus, who had failed in capturing anyone, looked down in silence for an extended period of time. 160 Backlund Street. Upon seeing the visitor outside, Butler Walter asked in surprise, "Your Excellency, why are you suddenly here? Is there something?" Bishop Electra chuckled and said, "I heard that Dwayne is sick, so I'm here to visit him. Perhaps he will quickly recover under the goddess's blessings." Chapter 780, Extract. Walter came to the third story and rapped on the master bedroom's door. "Who is it?" Dwayne Dantes' slightly weak and hoarse voice sounded. Walter turned the doorknob, opening a tiny crack in the door. "Sir, Bishop Electra is here to visit you. Do you wish to meet him in the living room or activity room, or should he be invited directly to your bedroom?" Usually, visitors weren't permitted to enter the master's bedroom. This was rather impolite, but visiting the sick was an exception. After a brief silence, Dwayne Dantes replied, "Invite him into the bedroom." "All right, sir." As Walter gestured Richardson to urge a maid to prepare some tea, he walked down and invited Bishop Electra of the Church of Evernight up. Soon, Electra entered the bedroom and saw Dwayne Dantes lying in bed, looking haggard. "Richardson, get the bishop a seat," the pale Dwayne Dantes said with a smile. Richardson had already done so. He immediately moved a high-back chair to a spot near the bed. However, Electra took a few steps forward to observe the new tycoon in town and asked in concern, "Dwayne, how are you? Did you consult a physician?" His spiritual perception wasn't triggered, so he didn't make any attempts. He was only visiting a pious believer out of concern. Dwayne Dantes coughed lightly and smiled. "I'm actually almost recovered. I believe I'll be able to head over to church tomorrow or the day after tomorrow to listen to your preachings." "That's good. I was wondering if I needed to pray to Goddess to bless you." Electra chuckled and took a step back before sitting on the chair which Richardson had brought for him. At this moment, Dwayne Dantes glanced at the bishop and chuckled. "Actually, I've always had a question. Are clergymen of the Church of the Goddess allowed to get married?" Electra, who was 2 years short of reaching 40, sighed and smiled. "This question has actually troubled us for the longest time. In ancient times, the archbishops had engaged in intense debates about this on several theosophical meetings. One side believed that servants of the goddess need to maintain their purity, be it men or women, otherwise it would be sacrilegious. The other side found words from the goddess in the Revelation of Evernight and other books, believing that the goddess encouraged marriage. She encouraged equality between both sexes and for them to have normal contact. Hence, clergymen should be an example of this, and not be a negative example. By doing so, that would be the greatest respect towards the goddess. In recent times, this question has basically been shelved. The Church doesn't ban or encourage it. The only request is that married clergymen are not to let their families live in the cathedrals. Dwayne Dantes nodded slowly as he curled the corner of his lips. "Your Excellency, do you have a wife?" Although Bishop Electra was thin and not very good-looking, he was pleasant to the eyes. He sighed and said, hardly hiding his smile, 2 years ago, I walked down the aisle under the goddess's watch. I happen to have a child this year. I originally imagined that I would remain single my entire life in order to serve goddess, but, as he spoke, he gave a self-deprecating laugh and shook his head. Without waiting for Dwayne Dantes to probe deeper, Electra asked, "You seem to be single as well. Are you considering the problem of marriage?" He seemed to imagine that Dwayne Dantes had such thoughts, and he directly asked, imagining that the answer was certain as he continued, "What kind of lady do you like? Perhaps I might be able to help introduce you to someone." Dwayne Dantes coughed lightly and said with a smile, "I often chose adventures to amass wealth in the past, so I wasn't willing to get married, afraid I would drag her down. I like many types of women and am not picky. I like those older than me, ones who can give me warmth and make me feel at ease." Before he finished, his valet, Richardson, wore a stunned expression. He hurriedly turned his head aside and lowered it. He felt his face burning for some baffling reason. Dwayne Dantes didn't seem to sense it as he continued, "I also like those younger than me, those who are pure and lively, making anyone who sees them feel as though it's dawn because of the radiance they aren't aware of." Bishop Electra's face suddenly froze as he raised his palm and clenched it into a fist as he held it to his mouth and coughed twice. Yet, Dwayne Dantes didn't stop. He shook his head and said with a sigh, "I also like those who were once in love or were married so that people wouldn't dare approach due to their status, women who can only be viewed from afar. They are so charming that each action of theirs are so intoxicating and irresistible. I often dream." Butler Walter, who was standing nearby, trembled. He felt as though he had experienced a dream that he didn't wish to wake up from despite opposing it greatly. He had no idea if it was a good or bad dream. Dwayne Dantes was about to continue to describe further, but he stopped producing any sound after opening his mouth. He then chuckled softly. "That's all very normal. When humans are at their limits and are under the influence of their senses, they often have some abnormal thoughts. As long as they're repressed while acting in line with one's will, it wouldn't feel like torture. One would still be a husband, a good father, a good man. That's very reasonable. When I'm incensed, I often have irrational thoughts, but few people will turn them into reality." Bishop Electra ingeniously changed the subject. As for Butler Walter and valet Richardson, they revealed looks of contemplation. The bishop didn't stay long. After drinking a few sips of the marquis black tea that the maid delivered, he got up and bade farewell, leaving Dwayne Dantes's residence. The room quickly turned quiet as the window at the balcony silently opened. Klein, who had changed back into Dwayne Dantes, agilely leaped inside. "Thankfully, I returned in time. If I allowed Rhodes to continue speaking, Bishop Electra would probably renounce a pious believer like me. Perhaps I'll even discover Walter and Richardson hanging from their rooms tomorrow morning, and the streets would have rumors of Dwayne Dantes being a pervert." Klein looked at the fake Dwayne on the bed and sighed silently. That final response had been personally formulated by him, and he got Rhodes to read it. Of course, this was his contingency plan for the worst possible scenario. He had believed that Rhodes wouldn't have made the situation develop that far. "Welcome back, great master." The Dwayne Dantes in bed bowed and greeted. "Did your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, do well?" Hearing the mirror stammer the question, Klein sighed and said, "It's still all right. You did pretty good. However, try not to agitate others when chatting." I will take note." The fake Dwayne Dantes rapidly vanished as a small mirror appeared on the pillow. Above the mirror, silver light bloomed as words appeared, "Thank you for your affirmation. I will continue following in your footsteps. I look forward to being of service to you the next time." After a goodbye expression was sketched out, the mirror returned to normal. Klein went close to it and put away the mirror before entering the bathroom attached to the master bedroom. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and headed above the gray fog. He wanted to complete the grazing before Mr. X's spirit body dispersed. In the book world, inside a cave on a snow-laden mountain peak. Klein looked at Mr. X's corpse and carefully identified the head that had been pieced together from the fragments. He matched it with his memories of the target's picture which Miss Magician had provided him. It's him. I hope I'll obtain traveling and record. With them, I would make a killing with this operation. Otherwise, I'll have to consider getting Miss Magician to pay more. The difficulty between hunting a sequence 5 and that of facing a demigod are two completely different matters. As Klein thought, he reached out his left palm and spread open his fingers, aiming at the corpse whose spirituality hadn't completely dispersed. Creeping hunger quickly transformed back into its original form, looking as though it was made of thin human skin, two eyes split open in the middle of its palm. Its pupils were bright red, as though they were dyed in blood. Amidst a cold and eerie wind, Mr. X's significantly dispersed spirit body in the resplendent beyonder specks of light that resembled the Milky Way drilled into Creeping Hunger, fixing onto a blank finger. Creeping Hunger first turned transparent as if it was a shadow of the spirit world before returning to normal. Klein closed his eyes and sensed it as his brows gradually eased. A smile surfaced on his face. His luck was pretty good this time because he had drawn one of the beyonder powers he wanted the most, Traveler's Door. It could also be called Door of Teleportation, or Traveling. Its effect was to allow a person to traverse the spirit world while sensing the external world. Beyonders of different sequences could endure traveling for different periods of time due to the differences in their spirit body's potency. This made the effects of spirit world traversal and the distance differ. If it's a sequence 9 or 8, they wouldn't be able to go beyond Backlund. With my present level, I wonder if I can directly head to the primitive island which Mr. Hanged Man provided. If that doesn't work, I can split it into a few trips. Klein thought as he smiled. At this point, he realized that a traveler's strength in head-on combat was very powerful. This was because the difficulty in using short-distance traveling was about the same as flaming jump. This also meant that a traveler could keep phasing around a target, opening up and narrowing distances as they pleased. This would catch people by surprise while also preventing them from inflicting a successful blow. Furthermore, if plenty of powers were recorded and the vigilance that accompanies immediately departing once something felt amiss, Klein suspected that even with lightning storm and hurricane, he had no way of restraining a traveler in direct combat. Indeed, a marionettist should try to hide behind the shadows. As Klein thought poignantly, he cast his eyes on Mr. X's corpse. Creeping Hunger had also obtained another beyonder power. It was door opening of the apprentice sequence. It was equivalent to a very weakened version of traveling and was of little value. Turning his gaze, Klein's eye noticed the ruby ring on Mr. X's hand. Chapter 781, Negative Effects. After staring at Mr. X's corpse for a while, Klein held back the urge to personally dig through his pockets for spoils of war. He made Wraith Senor take 2 steps and retrieve the ruby ring. This way, even if Mr. X carried an item with unimaginable negative effects, it would be endured by the marionette and not affect himself. After some careful inspecting, Senor held the ruby ring, 48 pounds in cash, and an ordinary pipe filled with tobacco and walked back. That's all? An oracle of the Aurora Order only has this much? Klein was rather surprised at this scene as he nearly cursed "pauper" at him. Soon, he recovered his calm and used his reasoning to convince himself that such a situation was very reasonable. Mr. X is a traveler. He can record the beyonder powers of others. He's considered an all-rounder. Even if such a powerhouse were to have other mystical items, he would tend to record them and not carry them around. This way, he could enjoy the benefits of the powers without suffering from the negative effects. That can prevent himself from killing himself. Using this line of thought, the effects of this ring was likely to be passive or triggered. With this in mind, Klein nodded gently. He made Senor carry Mr. X's cracked and sticky head, possess him, and return above the gray fog. Sitting behind the fool's seat, he was no longer afraid of anything. He directly took the ruby ring and used the method of divination in order to determine the actual effects of the mystical item. Its name is Flower of Blood. It allows the wearer to control their body at a deeper level. As long as they don't suffer from instant death or are completely purified, hence, losing the ability to control it, they will be able to slowly recover. This is equivalent to an instinct, a passive effect. From the looks of it, my choice of delivering a lethal strike with Death Knell was the correct one. If I hadn't used all my might, Mr. X might not have actually died. He would then be able to use the extreme pain to awaken himself and escape the control of a marionettist. He had also considered his weakness of being more of a spellcaster and having a body that was insufficient in strength. This ring has flesh magic to a certain degree. It's quite useful. As Klein held the ruby ring, he rapped the edge of the model table and muttered silently. He then began probing the Flower of Blood's negative effects. Nearly a minute later, Klein opened his eyes and left the dream. "Oh, come on. This?" he muttered as he wore a twisted look. With dream divination, he had interpreted the Flower of Blood's negative effects. It involved randomly making the wearer lose all rationale and the ability to think. Great. This is in line with the true creator. Klein couldn't help but grind his teeth. A negative effect that was completely random meant that the Flower of Blood had no way to be used. Thinking back to the scene from before, Klein muttered to himself in an amused and peeved manner, "Mr. X actually dared to wear such a ring?" That's right, people who change their faith to the true creator often don't have any facility to think. In that case, wearing such a ring wouldn't make them worse. Losing rationale isn't losing reason. It wouldn't be as bad as suddenly hurting others. But clearly, he would be very rigid and foolish, acting only on instinct. Phew. Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He decided to throw the Flower of Blood into the junk pile and not vex over it. From his point of view, it was a piece of crap that he couldn't use, nor was anyone willing to buy it unless he sold it to the Aurora Order. However, that would only make the true creator very happy. At that moment, he caught sight of Admiral of Blood Senior who was standing beside him through the corner of his eye. Klein's heart stirred as he clapped. Why didn't I think of that? I might not be able to use it, but I can let my marionette use it. After all, he's dead and he follows all my instructions. He doesn't need to think. Admiral of Blood, Flower of Blood. It's destined to be a pair. Although Senor has lost his control over his body because he's dead, I can provide that. This way, he can still be fixed even if he can't phase into a wraith in time, or if his zombie body isn't strong enough to withstand a blow, causing him to lose a limb or two. Of course, to a marionette, that's not important, as it doesn't affect his intrinsic character. The main goal is to obtain the additional flesh magic. A few seconds later, a delighted Klein made Senor pick up the ruby ring and wear it on his left index finger. After doing this, Klein made the wraith return to the gold coin before he raised his left palm and spread his fingers. He wanted to release the interrogator from creeping hunger. This was a promise he had made a long time ago. This was the last spirit body that had been grazed when he received creeping hunger. It was time to set it free. Amidst an indistinct cold wind, a blurry soul appeared by the side of the bronze table. He was a man in a navy uniform. He was in his 30s and had the rank of commander. He had brown whiskers on his painful and dazed face. "What's your name? How did Kalengos kill you?" Klein asked in a deep voice. The man jolted from his reverie and answered, "My name is Andy Hayden. The second mate of the Enmat. I died at a battle at sea." "No, I didn't die immediately. I was captured by a Phaeacian before I entered that glove of yours. I do not know of a Kalengos, much less heard of him." This interrogator was already inside the glove when Kalengos obtained creeping hunger. As psychic piercing is very useful, he didn't switch it. I wonder who the previous owner of Creeping Hunger was. Klein asked with piqued interest, who was the Faceation who caught you? What does he look like? Andy Hayden thought seriously and said, I don't know his name. I only remember his epaulet was that of a captain. I remember that he had a big, impressionable nose. I remember his eyes were blue, and his hair was close to blonde. He was almost 2 meters tall. Such people from Faceac are common, other than his identity as a captain. Klein considered for a moment and said, which year did you die? Andy Hayden's figure slowly dissipated away, and finally, it said, 1338, that's 12 years ago. Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos got famous less than 10 years ago. That captain might already be an admiral. Klein gently nodded and discovered that he had failed to ask if Andy Hayden had any last wishes. Forget it, setting him free is already a good deed. Klein quickly threw the matter to the back of his mind as he conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow. Please inform Miss Magician that Mr. X, Louis Veen, is dead. Please get her to take receipt of the item and the spellbook. I'll request it from her when I need it again. An endless grey fog filled Furz's eyes as the World Gehrman Sparrow's words emotionlessly rang in her ears. Although she was already prepared for this piece of news, she still found it unbelievable and unacceptable. He really succeeded? That storm in East Borough was created by him? Furz held down the upheavals in her heart. Taking advantage of the silent night, she set up a bestowment ritual in her bedroom. Before long, the candlelight and spirituality items created an illusory door. 2 items flew out and landed gently on the table. When Furz took a careful look, she nearly screamed as she hurriedly covered her mouth. She took 2 steps back and kept close to the wall of spirituality. One of the 2 items was her Lemano's travels, while the other item was a hideous head covered in cracks. It was stained with blood as if they had pieced together, as it seemed to shimmer with what appeared like reflected light on glass. As a graduate of med school, and having worked as a doctor at a well-known clinic, Furz had seen her fair share of corpses, but never had she seen such a disgusting, creepy, and terrifying head. After composing herself, Furz looked at the head again, identifying it to be Louis Veen's. She carefully used astromancy to make a final confirmation. Following that, she muttered with a slightly twisted expression, Mr. World shattered the target's head and then pieced them back together? At this moment, Furz couldn't help have a scene surface in her mind. It was of the cold Gehrman Sparrow sitting in front of a table, piecing together the bloody head fragments together, as though seriously putting a jigsaw puzzle together. This made Furz involuntarily shiver. She had an inexplicable feeling that the world was a psychotic killer with a serious mental illness. Moving her gaze away, she took 2 steps forward and picked up Lemano's Travels and casually flipped through it. Her gaze gradually froze because there were more spells in the spellbook, most of them seemingly related to wind and lightning. This made her recall the lightning storm that quickly passed in East Borough. She was convinced that it was created by Mr. World. Furz hurriedly flipped to the 3 charred yellow pages in Lemano's Travels and found them blank. She immediately had a guess, believing that the World Gehrman Sparrow had likely gained Mr. Fool's help to record beyond her powers at the demigod level. I just realized that if I have enough money and resources, I can hire the Tarot Club members to help me record different beyonder powers. This way, Lemano's Travels will become extremely powerful, but I don't have the money or resources. I can request for a reward from teacher this time. I can say that I paid quite a price to help seek revenge for him. Furz thought and first thanked Mr. Fool before asking him to pass on the message to the world. I'm very sorry that my payment isn't proportionate to the difficulty of the mission. After I receive a reward, I'll provide compensation. After the prayer, Furz ended the ritual and hurriedly hid the head. If Zio discovers this, she'll definitely imagine a horror story. After she was done, Furz clapped her hands as she thought leisurely. When Furz replied, Klein had already returned to the real world. All he heard was a vague female's voice. But even so, he couldn't help the fear and horror he felt. This was because Death Knell had given him an additional weakness, the fear of women. Chapter 782, Saturday night. On Saturday morning, Klein, who was wearing pajamas, rubbed his head and got out of bed. He didn't sleep well, as different women would inevitably enter his dreams, scaring him awake. He needed to spend several seconds to calm his emotions before returning to sleep again. Thankfully, this weakness only lasts 6 hours, and there's no need for me to head out in the middle of the night. I didn't have to face the maids. Klein sighed as he pulled the rope beside his bed. Richardson, who had been waiting outside, immediately entered with the clothes his employer needed to wear. "I've no idea what Rhodes said. Richardson seems to try to avoid me when facing me. Was it the kind of ladies he mentioned he likes, and that it happens to also be at odds with how society views it?" Klein happened to only hear the magic mirror mention the kind of women that Butler Walter liked when he rushed back. He wasn't sure what had happened prior to that. He didn't use dream divination to obtain the corresponding information, as he didn't feel that it was necessary. After all, with Richardson's personality, he wouldn't have the courage to take action no matter who he liked. It wouldn't have had any additional effects. After changing into his clothes, Klein headed to the second story and walked to the dining room. Walter was wearing white gloves as usual, waiting by the entrance. Upon seeing Dwayne Dante's approach, he took a step forward and bowed politely. "Good morning, sir. You have 2 lessons today. In the evening, you will be participating in the banquet at Mr. Portland Moment's place." Portland Moment lived at 100 Backlund Street. He was a full-time professor at Backlund University's Department of Engineering, a fellow at the Lone Kingdom Imperial Science Institute. As he had discovered a few metal alloys, he had received the Light of Machinery Award, and he was just second to people like Tirani von Helmesuen in the world of academics. Furthermore, the few metal alloys were widely used in ship and steam engine construction. Just the licensing patent was enough to make him a tycoon with a wealth of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Upon hearing Walter, Klein casually glanced at him, realizing that he had some dark eye circles. His eye bags were a little puffy, making him look different from usual. It was as though he hadn't slept well the entire night. If not for a faceless powers, Dwayne Dante's would probably look the same. Klein retracted his gaze in pity and didn't speak further. As he nodded gently in response to Walter's greetings, he entered the dining hall. To be honest, Klein was rather impressed with him. He was able to hold back his fantasies and stop himself from approaching her to seek out pleasure, despite frequently meeting a demoness. All he did was have wet dreams that included the target when alone at night. One had to know that a demoness, especially one who was in the midst of or having passed the pleasure sequence, had a charm that far exceeded a Beyonder's effects towards males. Every action was filled with a charm that made any men who came close to them feel intoxicated and lost. It was like consuming opioids and gradually developing into something more serious, to the point of not being able to extricate oneself from the pleasure given by a demoness. Perhaps only gay men could effectively resist such charms. Of course, Klein suspected that gay men were not immune to it either. This was because one's mind and hormones would be affected, creating changes that originally didn't exist. Furthermore, a large number of demonesses were men to begin with. This lowered one's psychological resistance. And precisely because of this, even though he was a Sequence 5 Beyonder, Klein had to constantly maintain a high-strung state when facing demonesses like Trissy and Tracy. He was afraid that any mishap might cause him to be charmed. Even he wasn't immune to such effects, much less an ordinary person like Butler Walter. This wasn't something that willpower alone could resist. Although perhaps being a result of Prince Edisac's death or her own advancement, Trissy was clearly able to rein in her charms. Walter is only an ordinary person. Even if he is one, he's at best a Sequence 9 or 8. For him to maintain his present state implies how strong his self-restraint is. He's very loyal to Prince Edisac, and he loves his wife and daughter. As Klein sighed, he sat down. Breakfast today was his favorite desi pie. The oil that effused out of it made him salivate. The sea late at night was nearly black as it was faintly dyed with a sliver of crimson red. It was calmer and quieter than in the day. The Blue Avenger was ebbing up and down in the waves like a ghost as it cruised towards the crimson moon. Alger Wilson stood at the bow, looking far away at the waves. On the surface, he appeared staid as usual, but deep down, he could hardly hold back his agitation. Ahead of him was the abyss maelstrom north of Sonia Island. As it was a dangerous vortex that was famous for appearing without any signs, no ship was willing to enter these dangerous waters. After delivering the report and leaving Pasu Island, Alger commandeered the Blue Avenger all the way north where they circled around Sonia Island and headed for this area. Midway, they had docked at a harbor for resupplies without wasting any more time. As for whether he would be suspected for heading north, Alger wasn't worried. This was because the Church of Storms was happy to have its captains head north of the Sonia Sea and the Fog Sea in order to obtain intel on the Fasak Empire, Intis Kingdom, Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun, and the Church of the God of Combat. Looking back at his ship, Alger walked deckside, took out a charm made of tin, held it in his palm, and chanted the incantation, Storm. A blue flame soared and devoured the charm. Alger suddenly sensed a baffling affinity with all the fish in the ocean beneath him. At that instant, both parties were able to communicate at the psyche level. The tin charm was one of the items he had obtained from his resupply at Pasu Island, allowing him to have an affinity with undersea creatures, providing a crude level of psychic communication with him. Amidst his thoughts, Alger didn't think of obtaining any intel. All he did was wait for the Blue Avenger to approach the Alger maelstrom and make a second attempt. Seconds turned into minutes as Alger, who had failed nearly 100 times, finally learned from a spindle-like fish about where Obninsks often appeared. If I didn't know that the target is near the abyss maelstrom, I would have long given up. It's really difficult to grasp any reliable information through a brute force search. Alger concluded as he touched his pocket. He had already used up most of his affinity charms, with only 5 left. I'll have to get another batch of them when I return. Others must not discover that I've expended all these. I heard the Rorstad Archipelago's resistance has plenty. Heh. As Alger was pondering, he changed the direction of the Blue Avenger for the spot he had just learned about. About an hour passed as the Blue Avenger stopped. Alger casually took out a sealed metal bottle. This was the sanguine anesthetic gas that he had spent 130 pounds to buy from the moon. He had no doubt in regards to its effects because he had used one in the past. As the Blue Avenger was a ghost ship, it didn't need many people to man it at night. There was only one person every night who was in charge of watching the ship, preventing it from deliberately creating problems or cruising into dangerous waters. As the captain, Alger had arranged himself to be on duty that night without anyone noticing. After he was done with his preparations, he came to the door of the sailors, took out a metallic pipe, and opened the bottle. He released the gas into each room, without even sparing the storeroom which stored all kinds of sundry. It was in case certain members of the crew were playing cards in there instead of sleeping. After doing all of this, Alger, who wasn't in a rush to concoct the potion, brought the ingredients with him, changing into a diving suit that was made of shark skin. He leaped from the starboard and into the water, without causing any splashes. Under the dark and calm waters, Alger's eyes gradually turned dark blue, allowing him to see his surroundings clearly. He breathed in the air within the water comfortably as he arrived in a pitch-black deep sea. Then, he used the affinity charm once again to communicate with the surrounding fish that were of different shapes and sizes. With the advice from the kind fish, Alger identified his bearings and swam as he asked, finally arriving at what seemed like an underwater volcano. The fish actually didn't know that an Obninsk stayed here. They only knew that their own kind and a number of top deep-sea hunters often disappeared in the vicinity. With his beyonder powers, Alger looked far ahead and saw the huge, black cave in the undersea volcano. Tentacles that were thicker than pythons found in a southern continent primitive forest gently flailed outwards. The huge suckers and patterned skin, as well as the cave that was several times the size of the Blue Avenger, left Alger apprehensive as he didn't dare approach. An Obninsk is at least a powerful sequence 5. Furthermore, it has a terrifying body. I can confirm that it's my target. Alger carefully swam over and stopped at a distance from the threat. After careful identification, he used the affinity charm once again. Following that, he allowed his spirituality to pass through the water and reach into the cave in an attempt to communicate with the powerful psyche force that was huddled inside. The massive psyche slowly relaxed as countless thoughts were released. It was taken aback for a moment before its psyche suddenly erupted like a volcano. Roar! Amidst a terrifying sound, the cave produced a ludicrous vortex that sucked the surrounding water, trash, as well as Alger towards it. It's filled with animosity. Alger's pupils constricted as his body turned slippery as he was driven by a formless wind backward in an attempt to escape. He used several beyonder powers before escaping the influence of the vortex. He didn't dare stay near the undersea volcano, and he quickly surfaced before opening up a gap. Almost a minute later, Alger, who had escaped the dangerous area, spat out bubbles as he heaved a sigh of relief. That Obninsk can actually resist the influence of charms that increase an affinity with sea creatures. Does it hate items with the Lord's aura? After some thought, Alger, who didn't wish to waste this opportunity, steeled his resolve since he had already come this far. He began using Elvish to pray amidst the seawater. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Chapter 783, The Trick to Communication. When he heard the illusory pleas, Klein was attending a banquet at Portland Moments Place due to the time difference. The banquet began from 7:30, and it continued all the way to 9:30, and even 10. This was because the appetizers, soup, side dishes, main dishes, staple food, vegetables, fruits, and desserts had numbered a total of 10 to 20 dishes. The footmen would serve the dishes one after the other, removing and changing dishes in unison to prevent the dining table from turning chaotic, and also providing an interval between the dishes in order to allow the guests to chat. Gentlemen would take the initiative to talk to the ladies to their right. In short, it's rather troublesome and exhausting. I even have to take note of which dish matches with which alcohol. However, it's quite tasty. Taking the opportunity when the roasted lamb was being switched out, he said to Ma'am Willis to his right, "My apologies. I'll need to use the washroom." He got up, pressing his right hand to his chest and bending over slightly as a gesture. Then, he left the dining hall and headed for one of the washrooms on the second story. Upon entering, he locked the door and immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise to head above the gray fog. Mr. Hanged Man's prayer. He wishes for me to help him in gaining the goodwill of an Obninsk, and he's willing to find 15 pages of Roselle's diary, or help me do something of equal value. His progress isn't slow. Klein sat at the fool's seat as he emanated his spirituality and touched the constantly burgeoning and contracting crimson star. After pondering for a few seconds, he said, "Investigate all Faysac captains who participated in the Konotop Sea battle in 1338. As a historian, Klein immediately knew which sea battle it was when he learned that the interrogator had died at the hands of a Phasacian in 1338. In 1338, the relationship between Lone and Faysac was tense with occasional conflicts. However, there was only one battle that resulted in the death of someone that was at the level of a commander. It was a sea battle that happened in East Balam's Konotop. And on a Phasacian fleet, there were definitely not many captains. In the deep, dark waters, Alger Wilson saw the endless grayish-white fog and heard Mr. Fool's answer. Investigate all the captains from the Fasak Empire that were involved in the Konotop Sea battle in 1338. Why would Mr. Fool pay attention to such a trivial figure? Is there some immense secret hidden in this matter? Alger's heart stirred. Without any hesitation, he directly agreed. Your wish is my wish. Such a mission was difficult and very complicated for him, but it wasn't dangerous. It was something that the present him could accept. After the response, Alger heard Mr. Fool's deep voice once again. You can return to the target's vicinity. That's it? As expected of Mr. Fool. After he obtained the authority, he is more like a sea god than Kelvetua. His might isn't limited to the Rorstad archipelago. Alger was delighted as he thanked the fool solemnly. Then, bending his back and kicking his legs, he turned to head down, diving into the depths once more. In just minutes, he returned beside the undersea volcano and saw a turbulent flow in the gigantic dark cave as the tentacles were flailing and had yet to calm down. Although Alger trusted Mr. Fool in being sufficiently powerful and terrifying, an awakening ancient god, he instinctively became cautious when he saw that scene. He carefully inched forward. He suspected that the Obninsk's flailing of its countless tentacles was a sign of welcoming him. And at this moment, above the grey fog, the sea god scepter-wielding Klein frowned slightly. It refuses to communicate with sea god, and it even hates the feeling, making it unwilling to show its goodwill, he muttered under his breath, exasperated. His influence on the surrounding waters through the Prey had failed. For some unknown reason, the Obninsk strongly resisted Beyonder powers that promoted an affinity with sea creatures. Through the prayer scene, he could see the thick tentacles thrashing about, and he vaguely sensed that the target was infuriated. It was trying to rip apart all living beings that dared approach it. Mr. Hanged Man has gone over. He's going over. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he decided to switch his approach. He raised the sea god scepter a little higher, allowing the blue gems at the tip light up one after another, emitting a bright, blinding light. Right on the heels of that, he directed the violent aura of lightning storm over, casting it on the Obninsk. The thick tentacles that thrashed about at the bottom of the sea suddenly froze before falling down. They clung close to the seabed as countless green points of lights appeared in the dark cave. Amidst a jarring rumbling sound, a terrifying monster that could devour a sailboat crawled out. Its patterned black body was massive and distorted. It had a total of 3 heads, and each head had more than a dozen eyes. All of them were emitting a green light. The monster then prostrated, appearing as obedient as a trained hound. Indeed, tricks are needed in communication. Klein nodded in satisfaction and once again used the Beyonder affinity powers to make the Obninsk open the mouths of its 3 heads via a psychic connection. This made Alger instantly see 3 dark caves, each of them large enough to provide a sailboat passage inside. Praise be to Mr. Fool. Alger looked at the magnificent scene before him as he couldn't help but mutter inwardly. He didn't waste any time, and he chose the middle head by quickly swimming towards it. A spiraled and warped passage quickly appeared in Alger's vision as the walls were made of flesh. The width was comparable to the bow of the Blue Avenger. Whoosh! Water flowed into the passage, heading right for the deep depths. Alger took the opportunity to let his body go with the flow. Suddenly, he felt as though he was back as a sailor, engaging in combat amidst waves, groggy from being tossed around. It couldn't be sustained. By the time Alger used his Beyonder powers and got a hold of himself, he had already left the tunnel of flesh. He was in a dark, spacious world, with a sticky sensation by his feet. There was a putrid stench everywhere around him. In just a second, Alger realized that the liquid inside was corroding him. He hurriedly produced a water membrane as he made it swell into a transparent sphere. He knew that he was already inside the Obninsk's stomach. Without any hesitation, he took out all the bottles he had long prepared and began concocting the potion. As the supplementary ingredients were thrown into the wide-mouthed metal bottle, they mixed into a dark blue liquid. Following that, Alger carefully threw in a jellyfish that enveloped azure-blue seawater in its translucent membrane. The distant and ethereal singing grew in intensity before calming down. In the bottle, there wasn't any ripples or bubbles. The liquid was dark, just like the ocean before a storm. Alger calmed his mind, entered cogitation, and picked up the metal bottle before cleanly downing the ocean songster potion inside. The liquid was cold as it brought about a numbness that slid down his gullet and into his stomach. It then spread throughout his body cells at an unimaginable speed. At that instant, Alger vaguely heard countless voices. They came from all life at sea, but the Obninsk's body blocked most of it, leaving a relatively screened-out version. Plop. 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 Alger felt his heart beating violently as it spewed blood outwards. His spirituality and the sound waves began to remold his voice and soul. He couldn't help it as he opened his mouth, letting out a loud sigh. Amidst the sigh, Alger felt his spirit body being ripped slightly. As the sound waves spread outwards, they first turned into mottled scales on his skin before pulling out long flesh tendrils that appeared like flailing tentacles. The sound wave continued spreading outwards with his spirit body fragments, making contact with the sticky liquid within the Obninsk's stomach, and they magically bounced back, infusing Alger's body once again. Alger, who was on the brink of losing control, instantly felt better as he seized the opportunity. Without any fear of embarrassing himself, he began singing loudly in a bid to vent the invisible sound waves that would blast his body apart. Rough, messy, off-tuned singing filled with a metallic quality spread outwards, wave after wave, mixing with the numerous spirit body fragments before bouncing back on the Obninsk's sticky stomach walls. In this process, Alger was like an ingredient being baked in sound waves as he was molded into form. Finally, he regained control of his body, and he grasped his spreading spirituality. At last, Alger closed his eyes as a smile couldn't help but appear on his face. He had completed the first goal he had for all these years, to advance to Ocean Songster. I've gained superficial control of lightning, gaining a more all-round underwater mobility, as well as the ability to use singing to affect targets. The latter ability is different because of every person's uniqueness, producing different branching paths. One of them is to use beautiful singing to disrupt an enemy's spirit body, causing him to turn adrift and fall into a daze. Another is to raise one's explosive strength, another is to simulate a thunderous boom to leave others in awe, and another is to use chaotic and unpleasant singing to leave the enemy frustrated, causing them to lose their rationality. Alger inspected himself as his expression turned a little odd. He soon put these thoughts away, picked up his items, and swam towards the Obninsk's mouth before gently tapping on the already closed mouth. The mouth slowly opened as it roared suddenly, spewing out everything in its mouth. Alger instantly felt as though he was in midair as he nearly collided with a shark. After a series of actions, he surfaced and swam towards the Blue Avenger. Only after the ghost ship's outline was reflected in his eyes did he truly heave a sigh of relief. Alger was only worried that something out of the ordinary would happen to the Blue Avenger while he was advancing. Although an hour or two wasn't a huge problem, there were always all kinds of surprises in this world. After receiving Mr. Hanged Man's gratitude again, Klein returned to the real world, washed, and dried his hands before leaving the washroom and walking towards the dining hall. As the fragrance of food inundated his olfactory senses once again, he slowly drew a breath as he returned to his seat with a smile. As he gestured to the guests, he sat down. At this point, it was already time for dessert. From the looks of it, I stayed too long in the washroom. I hope that after today there wouldn't be talks about Dwayne Dante's having constipation. Klein silently muttered to himself as he smiled at Ma'am Willis to his right and said, "When I was young, I ate all kinds of strange food in the southern continent. One of them was called tennet tree plums. They taste like bland butter, just like these desserts." He euphemistically explained the reason for his delay by implying that he had weakened his stomach from his younger days. Chapter 784, Character Assassination. Ma'am Willis glanced at Dwayne Dantes and said with a smile, completely unfazed, "Your past, and your experiences in Desi Bay and the southern continent, are more interesting than any novel I've read. It makes me feel like having a similar experience of my own. Of course, they're just real-life stories that have been tweaked. It's all thanks to Anderson Hood, a hunter that goes everywhere." As Klein cast his gaze on a tiny butter cake, he chuckled. "It's because those are only the interesting ones. There are many that I'd rather not be reminded of." After that simple statement, he began enjoying the dessert. However, when Ma'am Willis and the other ladies heard that, they were somehow reminded of a best-selling novel, A Man with a Story. To them, Dwayne Dantes was such a man. Although he looked like a placid lake, there was more deep down. Hidden there were more pleasant surprises and plenty of pain. The banquet ended 20 minutes to 10. A number of gentlemen and ladies went to the card room to play 2 hours of Texas Hold'em, while the remaining men headed for the activity room to have a chat. They didn't bar women from joining, but as it was inevitable for them to broach on sexual matters while smoking, no women joined them. They either circled the piano at the first story and listened to and sang along with the performer, or they grouped up to play chess. Klein chose to head to the activity room on the second story. Private conversations with a few people had helped him speed up his admission into the circle. After entering the room, he observed the environment and went straight for the windows to open them. Then, he pulled a nearby high-back chair to sit down. Just as he did this, he saw the banquet's host, Portland Moment, laugh with a pipe in hand. Men often need some space for themselves. His voice was sonorous, and he had a big build. He was an elder in his 60s with a ruddy complexion and rather thick hair despite being all white. His facial features were the most classic features of a Loanese man with nothing that stood out. Yes, men have to take note of their image when the ladies are around. We have to be considerate about their thoughts. "I've already wanted to kiss this an hour ago," Hazel's father, member of parliament, mocked, took out a gorgeous silver box, taking out a cigar from inside. The other men in the activity room did the same as pipes or cigarettes appeared in their hands as though they were pulling off a magic trick. As the flames flickered, wisps of smoke began to billow, filling the room as though the smog from yesteryear hadn't dispersed. After enjoying it for a few seconds with his eyes closed, Portland Moment looked to the guest by the window and asked, "Dwayne, do you not smoke?" Klein clenched his fist and placed it to his mouth, coughing slightly as he said, "I have yet to recover. The doctor advised me not to smoke for the time being." To be frank, he was almost choking. Thankfully, he had smartly chosen a seat by the window. This group smoke like chimneys. Klein curled his right index finger and rubbed against his nostrils. He had the urge to use the beyonder powers of a magician to create an invisible air pipe that extended outside to draw in fresh air so as to escape the harm of secondhand smoke. But considering how there might be beyonders hiding amongst these men, he wisely gave up on the idea. Portland Moment laughed upon hearing that. "I heard from Bishop Electra that it's not without reason that you were sick. You lack a wife." This professor was a believer of the god of steam and machinery, but his wife was a believer of the Evernight goddess. Therefore, they had taken up residence in Buckland Street near St. Samuel Cathedral. He often had bishops visiting him and having exchanges. "Is he mocking me for thinking about women despite being sick? I really couldn't tell that Bishop Electra is actually a man who likes spreading gossip. It's all a Rhodes's fault." Klein lampooned and shook his head with a smile. "I place great importance on marriage. I'd rather remain single if there's no one suitable." At this moment, the high-ranking employee of the Backlund Municipal Office, Mr. Willis, spewed out smoke and said, "Actually, I envy Dwayne's single status. It allows him to be able to pursue any kind of woman that he likes." He had deliberated enunciated any kind, causing ambiguous laughter to sound out. The matter of Dwayne Dantes' wide preferences and him never rejecting any charming woman has already spread across this street. Klein held back his right hand to prevent himself from subconsciously rubbing his temples. He felt that the deep, dignified, handsome, gregarious new tycoon's image was undergoing a subtle change. He first suspected that it was the loudmouth, Bishop Electra, that had spread the news, but later believed that it was Butler Walter who had proactively gotten the servants to spread the gossip. This was because a nearly flawless, charming gentleman would often be unknowingly ostracized by members of the same sex in a circle. But when a blemish surfaced, with a topic that could be used in jest, it made it easier for him to build closer ties. Klein wasn't angry about such treatment. Instead, he deliberately gave a wry smile in a rather gentlemanly manner. "That's why I have difficulty choosing, causing me to remain single to this day." Ha! Portland Moment and company laughed in unison. Member of Parliament mocked then said, "What you need is to be a little more decisive. A good marriage and a good family aids a man greatly." He stopped teasing him and gave serious advice. "From the looks of it, no matter which world you're in, you can't escape the fate of being pressured into marriage." Klein nodded gently and glanced out the window, taking in the night scenery of Portland Moment's garden. At this moment, he saw a figure. It was Hazel Mocked, who was dressed in a black-green gown, following a trail going deeper into the garden, pausing from time to time to look around as though she was looking for something. Wasn't this lady playing the piano just now? Why would she suddenly be in the garden? When Klein retracted his gaze, Hazel's figure was blocked by flowers. When guests attend banquets or balls, leaving the hall to head into the garden isn't something impolite. After all, it's a very stylish habit to take a stroll under the moon and take in the flowery aroma of the night winds. However, this often implies a rendezvous. Who's Hazel rendezvousing with? No, it doesn't seem like it. No one that came today is truly her equal. Although she doesn't appear as arrogant after the fright she suffered in the sewers, making her occasionally look depressed, she still seems to belittle ordinary people deep down. She's dealing with the negative effects of the mystical item? That doesn't make sense. Entering a lounge or the washroom would be better than the garden since there's more privacy. Furthermore, back at the ball held at her place, she also went to the third story and not the garden. Klein eliminated the various impossibilities and finally had a theory. From the way Hazel is trying to sense or find something, she seems to have noticed some abnormality and plans to observe and deal with it up close. Does this also mean that there's some paranormal activity happening in Professor Portland Moment's house? If that's true, this professor or someone in his family isn't simple at all. The bishops of the St. Samuel Cathedral haven't realized anything despite them visiting often. A marauder's senses and observation skills in certain areas definitely stand out. Klein didn't have any thoughts of intervening in the situation outside. After all, something that Hazel could sense was definitely nothing too dangerous. Besides, St. Samuel Cathedral was nearby. If there were any hidden secrets, no one would attempt to escalate matters and, would instead, try to lay low. At this moment, Mocked finally calmed down from an untasteful joke and looked towards Portland Moment. "I heard you'll be leaving Backlund University." Professor Portland Moment sucked at his pipe and said, "That's right. The Higher Education Commission wishes that I become the Chancellor of the reorganized Backlund University of Technology. Although a large amount of my wealth comes from metal alloys, what I'm best at is mechanical engineering. They've promised to build me a better laboratory there, and also provide me with more funding. At my age, having more autonomy and helpers is more important." Mr. Willis echoed with a smile, "And Backlund University will have a full-time professor spot empty up. Those senior associate professors that have been waiting for decades can finally have a chance." In Lone's tertiary education system, full-time professors weren't just a title, but also a post. It was equivalent to a dean, so there was only one. Backlund University of Technology. Klein smiled as he listened, keeping silent on matters he didn't know much about. In the garden, Hazel arrived in a dark and secluded corner. She had discovered that ants and other insects on the ground were gathering in an abnormal manner, and her spiritual perception felt that something was hidden here. This was innate to her sequence, and it had never failed in the past. Without any additional help, she could directly choose the precious items hidden among several sealed boxes. Of course, she wasn't able to distinguish what it was exactly. All she knew was that compared to the rest, what her spiritual perception told her was something definitely more valuable. Just like Mr. Dwayne Dantes. He definitely has extremely precious items on him. Hazel curled the corners of her lips as she cast her gaze at the soil, which looked a little loose. She sensed that copious amounts of spirituality were gathered underneath, thus attracting insects and souls. It's not a human body. It's some spirituality-equipped materials that have been used. They should have been thrown away in batches, but they were instead buried together, causing unnecessary changes. Hazel's eyes turned darker as she interpreted the situation underground based on the unhidden spirituality traits and changes. She tipped her chin slightly and looked back at the building. She believed that Portland Moment's family had at least one person with extraordinary powers. And if this problem in the garden wasn't resolved, the nearby houses would have paranormal activity in the coming days. Hazel retracted her gaze, extended her left hand, and aimed it at the soil. With a gentle grip, she slowly twisted her wrist. The gathered spirituality vanished as though it had been stolen by someone. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.